Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through the shadows of time itself. Tonight, we'll explore the complete saga of the Sheikah, those enigmatic guardians whose devotion to the goddess and tragic fate spans millennia. From their sacred origins as chosen protectors to their technological mastery and ultimate betrayal, this is a tale of loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of wisdom. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift through the mists of ancient history. Close your eyes when ready, and let us walk together through the hidden paths of the Shadow Folk's eternal story. In the beginning, when time itself was young and the very foundations of reality were still settling into their eternal patterns, three divine beings of incomprehensible power looked upon the void and decided that existence was preferable to nothingness. Din, the goddess of power, stretched forth her mighty arms and ignited the fires of creation, her divine strength giving birth to the red earth and the molten core that would sustain all life to come. Nehru, the goddess of wisdom, opened her eyes and gazed upon the formless matter that Din had created, her infinite intelligence, bringing forth the laws of physics and the principles of order that would govern how all things moved and interacted throughout eternity. Furore, the goddess of courage, breathed upon the ordered world and filled it with the spark of life itself, creating all the living beings that would walk, swim, fly, and grow across the surface of this new realm. These three golden goddesses, having completed their work of creation, departed from the physical realm, but left behind a sacred artifact that contained the essence of their combined power. The Triforce, as it came to be known, was a golden relic of three interlocking triangles, each one representing one of the divine creators, and containing within it the power to grant the deepest wish of whoever might claim it with a pure and balanced heart. The Triforce was far too powerful to be left unguarded, and so the goddesses appointed one of their own to watch over it and protect the surface world from those who would abuse such incredible might. Hylia, a goddess whose wisdom and compassion made her the perfect choice for this sacred duty, accepted the responsibility of guardian and protector, establishing her dominion over the surface realm and all the creatures that called it home. Under Hylia's watchful care, the surface world flourished in ways that seemed to touch the very edges of paradise. The land itself pulsed with divine energy, its rivers running clearer than crystal, and its forests growing with such vibrant life that every leaf seemed to capture and reflect the goddess's own radiance. The creatures that lived there, both great and small, existed in harmony with one another and with the natural forces that sustained them, their lives guided by an instinctive understanding of their place in the greater cosmic order. As the ages passed and the world settled into the rhythms that would define its existence for millennia to come, various tribes of people began to emerge and establish themselves across the surface. Some were drawn to the mountains, where they learned to work with stone and metal and found strength in the earth itself. Others were called to the waters, where they developed the grace and wisdom that comes from understanding the flow of rivers and the depths of lakes. Still others found their home in the deserts or the forests or the high peaks where the wind sang eternal songs of freedom and possibility. Among all these diverse peoples, there were two tribes that stood apart from the others, marked by qualities that suggested they were destined for purposes beyond the ordinary concerns of daily survival and tribal politics. The first of these was distinguished by their incredible physical strength and their natural affinity for the forces of nature, their members growing to impressive size and developing abilities that bordered on the supernatural. But it was the second tribe that would come to play the most crucial role in the unfolding drama of divine history. The Sheikah, as they came to be called, were a people unlike any other who had walked the surface world. Where other tribes were marked by their connection to particular elements or environments, the shadow folk seemed to exist at the intersection between the physical and the spiritual realms, their abilities drawing upon forces that transcended normal human understanding. They moved through darkness as easily as others walked in daylight, their senses so keen that they could detect the slightest changes in their environment, and their reflexes so swift that they seemed to anticipate danger before it fully manifested. But what truly set the Sheikah apart was not their remarkable physical abilities, but the spiritual quality that suffused their entire being. They possessed an innate understanding of the sacred, an intuitive connection to the divine realm that allowed them to perceive truths hidden from ordinary mortals. When they looked upon the world, they saw not just the surface reality of rocks and trees and flowing water, but the deeper patterns of meaning and purpose that connected all things in an intricate web of divine intention. It was this spiritual sensitivity that drew the attention of the goddess Sheikah herself. As she observed the various tribes that had emerged across her domain, she recognized in the Sheikah a people who could serve as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms, guardians who would understand both the sacred nature of their duties and the terrible cost that such service might require. They possessed the wisdom to comprehend the full implications of their calling and the strength of character to remain faithful even when faith demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The divine appointment came not through elaborate ceremony or public proclamation, but in the quiet moments when the goddess's voice spoke directly to the hearts and minds of those she had chosen. To the Sheikah people, individually and collectively, came the sacred charge that would define their destiny for all the ages to come. Serve and protect her grace from any danger, no matter how great the threat or how terrible the price that service might demand. The task entrusted to them was simple in its statement but profound in its implications. They were to be the goddess's earthly guardians, her chosen protectors who would stand between the forces of light and the darkness that would inevitably seek to challenge divine authority. They would be her eyes and ears in the mortal world, watching for signs of danger and preparing defenses against threats that might not become apparent until it was too late for conventional responses. But more than mere bodyguards or sentries, the Sheikah were called to be something far more significant and demanding. They were to be the keepers of sacred knowledge, the preservers of divine wisdom, and the guardians of secrets that could reshape the world if they fell into the wrong hands. Their loyalty would need to transcend personal desire, family obligation, and even tribal identity, for they served a cause that was greater than any earthly concern. With this divine appointment came abilities and knowledge that set the Sheikah even further apart from their fellow mortals. The goddess granted them mastery over the subtle arts of concealment and misdirection, allowing them to move unseen through even the most carefully guarded places and to gather information that others thought safely hidden. They learned to read the signs written in shadow and starlight, to interpret the meaning of dreams and omens, and to understand the flow of spiritual energies that connected all living things. The symbol that came to represent their sacred calling was as mysterious and profound as the people themselves. The tearing eye, as it would be known in later ages, depicted a single eye with a tear falling from it, surrounded by patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which they were viewed. This emblem captured the dual nature of the Sheikah, calling to see all, even when such sight brought sorrow, and to weep for the pain of the world while never allowing that grief to compromise their vigilance. Under the protection and guidance of their divine patron and her chosen guardians, the surface world entered a golden age of peace and prosperity that would be remembered in song and story for countless generations. The land thrived under Hylia's beneficent rule, its people growing in wisdom and skill while remaining mindful of their place in the greater order of creation. Trade routes connected distant communities. Scholars preserved and expanded upon the accumulated knowledge of their peoples, and artists, created works of such beauty that they seem to capture fragments of divine inspiration within mortal materials. The Sheikah themselves, while remaining somewhat apart from the daily concerns of ordinary tribal life, were not isolated hermits or mysterious figures who avoided all contact with their fellow mortals. Instead, they wove themselves into the fabric of surface society in ways that strengthened and protected the entire community. They served as healers and teachers, as guides for travelers venturing into dangerous territories, and as mediators when disputes arose between different groups or individuals. Their wisdom was sought by leaders making difficult decisions, their knowledge consulted by scholars seeking to understand the deeper mysteries of existence, and their protection valued by anyone who understood the true nature of the threats that might emerge from the shadows. Yet they never sought to dominate or control others, for they understood that their role was to serve and protect rather than to rule or command. As the years flowed past like water in an eternal stream, the Sheikah developed their abilities and refined their understanding of the sacred duties that defined their existence. They built hidden training grounds where the young could learn the subtle arts of their calling, established secret caches where important knowledge and materials could be preserved against future need, and created networks of communication that allowed information to flow swiftly across vast distances without alerting potential enemies to their activities. The Shadow Folk also began to develop the unique philosophical outlook that would characterize their people throughout all the ages to come. They understood that light and darkness were not simple opposites, but complementary forces that defined and gave meaning to one another. Without darkness, light would have no significance. Without shadow, illumination would be meaningless. Their role was not to eliminate darkness from the world, an impossible task that would ultimately destroy the very foundations of existence, but to ensure that light remained strong enough to prevent darkness from overwhelming everything else. This understanding led them to embrace what other peoples might consider contradictory aspects of their nature. They were warriors who preferred to avoid violence, scholars who treasured secrets more than public recognition, and guardians who protected others by remaining hidden rather than standing openly at their side. They learned to find strength in apparent weakness, victory in seeming defeat, and truth in the spaces between what was said and what remained unspoken. Yet even in this age of unprecedented peace and prosperity, the wisest among the Sheikah understood that their golden era was not destined to last forever. The goddess Hylia had shared with her chosen guardians glimpses of the great patterns that shaped the flow of cosmic history, and in those visions they had seen shadows gathering at the edges of reality, ancient powers stirring in their primal slumber, preparing to challenge the divine order that had brought such harmony to the surface world. The Shadow Folk began to prepare for trials they could not yet clearly see, challenges that would test their loyalty, their wisdom, and their very survival as a people. They developed contingency plans for threats that existed only in prophetic dreams, trained for battles that might not come for generations, and preserved knowledge that might prove crucial in circumstances they could barely imagine. As the Golden Age continued, unmarked by any external signs of approaching crisis, the Sheikah maintained their vigilant watch. They stood ready to fulfill their sacred calling when the time came, knowing that the service demanded of them might cost them everything they held dear, yet never wavering in their commitment to the goddess who had chosen them and the world they were sworn to protect. The divine appointment that had elevated them from among all the surface tribes carried with it responsibilities that transcended any earthly understanding of duty or loyalty. They were the guardians of the sacred order itself, the protectors of the divine balance that kept existence stable and meaningful. When the darkness finally stirred and the trials began, they would stand firm in their calling, no matter what personal cost that service might require. The age of innocence was drawing toward its close, though none among the surface dwellers could yet perceive the signs of what was coming. But the Sheikah watched and waited, their eyes fixed on the distant horizons of possibility, their hearts prepared for whatever sacrifice their sacred duty might demand. The goddess's chosen guardians were ready to face the storm that was even now gathering strength in the deepest shadows of reality, preparing to test their faith and their devotion in ways that would echo through all the ages yet to come. The golden age of peace and divine protection that had blessed the surface world for countless generations was destined to face its greatest trial, a test that would shake the very foundations of reality and force the Sheikah to confront the true meaning of their sacred calling. The darkness that had slumbered in the deepest reaches of existence was finally stirring, gathering its malevolent strength for an assault upon the divine order that had brought such harmony and prosperity to the mortal realm. In the furthest depths of the underworld, where light had never touched and hope was nothing more than a distant memory, an ancient evil was awakening from its primordial slumber. This was not merely a powerful monster or ambitious tyrant seeking earthly dominion, but something far more terrible and fundamental, a force of pure destruction that existed in opposition to the very concept of creation itself. Demise, the Demon King, was rising once more to challenge the goddesses and claim the ultimate prize that had been placed beyond his reach for so long. The Triforce, that sacred relic containing the combined essence of Din, Nehru and Faror, called to him with an irresistible song of power that echoed through dimensions and drove him to a fury that transcended rational thought. He had waited through eons of imprisonment and exile, nursing his hatred and planning his revenge against the divine beings who had denied him what he considered his rightful possession. Now, at last, the time had come to emerge from the shadows and take by force what had been withheld from him by divine decree. The Demon King's form was a nightmare made manifest, a being whose very existence seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Where the golden goddesses had been creatures of pure creative energy, Demise embodied the opposite principle: destruction, negation, the unmaking of all that had been brought into being. His presence poisoned the very air around him, turning fertile ground to ash and causing the life force to drain from any living thing that came too close to his malevolent aura. Yet Demise was not merely a mindless force of annihilation, but possessed an intelligence that was both vast and utterly malevolent. He understood the cosmic principles that governed existence, but where the goddesses had used this knowledge to create beauty and order, the Demon King sought to pervert and corrupt everything he touched. His goal was not simply to possess the Triforce, but to use its power to remake reality according to his own twisted vision, creating a universe where suffering and despair were the fundamental laws governing all existence. The surface world, basking in its age of peace and prosperity, was utterly unprepared for the cataclysm that was about to descend upon it. The various tribes had grown comfortable in their security, their warriors more concerned with ceremonial displays than actual combat. Their leaders focused on trade agreements and cultural exchanges rather than military preparedness. Even among the Sheikah, despite their prophetic visions and their understanding of the cosmic cycles, the full magnitude of what was coming remained hidden behind veils of divine mystery. When Demise finally burst forth from his underworld prison, the very foundations of the surface realm trembled with the force of his emergence. The sky itself seemed to crack like a broken mirror, allowing streams of malevolent energy to pour down upon the peaceful lands below. The sweet air that had carried the scent of flowers and growing things suddenly reeked of sulfur and decay, while the clear streams that had nourished all life began to run dark with corruption. The Demon King's armies followed in his wake, countless legions of monsters and demons that had been spawned in the deepest pits of the underworld, creatures of pure malice, whose only purpose was to spread destruction and terror throughout the mortal realm. These were not natural beings that had been corrupted or twisted, but entities that had been forged from concentrated evil. Their every breath an assault upon the life force itself. Bokoblins swarmed across the land in numbers that defied counting, their crude weapons and savage instincts laying waste to everything in their path. Moblins, massive and powerful, smashed through defensive walls as if they were made of paper, while Stalfos warriors, animated by dark magic and immune to fear or pain, pressed forward in relentless waves that never tired and never retreated. Above them flew creatures of nightmare Keese, whose wings blotted out the sun, and Erelphos, whose aerial assaults struck without warning from the clouded sky. The various surface tribes, despite their individual strengths and capabilities, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale and ferocity of the demonic invasion. Warriors who had trained for years in the peaceful arts of ceremonial combat discovered that their skills were woefully inadequate against enemies that felt no pain, showed no mercy, and fought with a coordination that spoke of supernatural intelligence directing their every move. The mountain people, strong and resilient though they were, found their fortress-like settlements breached by creatures that could scale vertical cliffs as easily as walking on level ground. The forest dwellers, masters of stealth and archery, discovered that their enemies could see in perfect darkness and moved through the woodland shadows with predatory efficiency that matched their own. Even the desert nomads, accustomed to harsh conditions and fierce independence, were driven from their ancestral territories by monsters that thrived in the blazing heat and seemed to draw strength from the very desolation they created. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that the true nature of the Sheikah calling became clear. While other tribes fled in terror or died fighting hopeless battles against overwhelming odds, the Shadow Folk understood that this catastrophe was precisely what they had been preparing for throughout all the long years of peace. Their sacred duty was not merely to protect the goddess in times of tranquility, but to serve as her champions when the forces of ultimate evil arose to challenge the divine order itself. The Sheikah response to Demise's invasion was swift, coordinated, and utterly different from the chaotic resistance offered by the other surface peoples. Where others fought as individuals or small groups, guided by instinct and desperation, the Shadow Folk moved with the precision of a single organism. Their actions coordinated through communication methods that transcended normal human understanding. They had trained for this moment across generations, passing down techniques and strategies through carefully preserved oral traditions that prepared each new generation for the ultimate test of their faith and abilities. Their approach to the demonic invasion reflected the fundamental philosophy that had always guided their people, the understanding that light and darkness were complementary forces that defined one another, and that victory would come not through the elimination of their enemies, but through the restoration of proper balance. They did not seek to meet Demise's armies in direct confrontation, knowing that such an approach would only result in the destruction of the forces of light. Instead, they employed the subtle arts that had been their specialty since the beginning of their calling, using misdirection, stealth, and spiritual power to achieve objectives that could never be accomplished through brute force alone. The Shadow Folk began by establishing hidden networks throughout the war-torn surface realm, creating safe havens where refugees could find shelter and wounded warriors could recover their strength. These sanctuaries were concealed not merely through physical camouflage, but through spiritual techniques that made them invisible to the supernatural senses of demonic scouts. To ordinary mortals fleeing the destruction, these refuges appeared like miracles, places where the corruption and despair that had infected the rest of the world seemed unable to penetrate. More importantly, The Sheikah served as the primary intelligence network for the forces of light, gathering information about enemy movements and capabilities that proved crucial for coordinating what resistance was possible. Their ability to move unseen through territory controlled by demonic forces allowed them to map the invasion patterns, identify key commanders among the enemy ranks, and discover weaknesses that could be exploited by conventional military forces when opportunities arose. But perhaps their most crucial role was serving as the spiritual anchors that prevented the surface realm from being completely overwhelmed by the waves of malevolent energy that poured forth from Demise himself. The Demon King's presence was not merely physically destructive but spiritually corrosive, poisoning the very essence of reality and causing the fundamental laws that governed existence to begin breaking down. Without the Sheikah's constant efforts to maintain spiritual balance, the surface world would have dissolved into chaos long before any military resistance could be organized. The Shadow Folk accomplished this through rituals and ceremonies that had been preserved in their most secret teachings, practices that required tremendous personal sacrifice from those who performed them. Individual Sheikah warriors would position themselves at key spiritual nexus points throughout the realm, using their own life force to create barriers against the encroaching darkness. Many of these guardians paid the ultimate price, their bodies unable to withstand the spiritual strain of channeling divine energy in such quantities. But their sacrifice created pockets of stability where the forces of light could regroup and plan their counterattacks. Yet despite all their efforts, despite the courage and wisdom they brought to bear against the forces of ultimate evil, the Sheikah and their allies were slowly but steadily losing the war. Demise's power was simply too great, his armies too numerous, and his understanding of cosmic forces too profound for any mortal resistance to overcome through conventional means. The Demon King was not merely seeking conquest but transformation, working to remake the entire surface realm in his own image of corruption and despair. As the war raged on and the situation grew increasingly desperate, the goddess Hylia was forced to confront a terrible reality. Despite her divine nature and the incredible power at her disposal, she could not directly intervene to stop Demise without risking the complete destruction of both the surface realm and everyone who lived there. The cosmic laws that governed the relationship between divine and mortal realms prevented her from unleashing her full might against the Demon King, for such an action would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. The solution that Hylia devised was as brilliant as it was heartbreaking, a strategy that would save the surface world but at a cost that would echo through all the ages to come. She would divide her attention and resources, protecting what could be saved while positioning other pieces for a future victory that might take generations to achieve. The most vulnerable inhabitants of the surface realm, the ordinary mortals who lacked the strength or abilities to contribute meaningfully to the war effort, were gathered together by the goddess's power and lifted into the sky itself, carried away from the immediate danger on floating islands that existed above the reach of demonic corruption. These sky islands, sustained by Hylia's divine energy, would serve as refuges where human civilization could continue to exist and grow, even while the surface world burned below. Along with these refugees, the goddess also lifted the Triforce itself into the heavens, removing the ultimate prize that Demise sought from his immediate reach. The sacred relic would remain hidden among the clouds, protected by divine power and waiting for the day when it could safely return to play its destined role in the cosmic order. Yet even as she moved to protect the innocent and preserve the most sacred artifacts, Hylia did not abandon the surface realm entirely. The war against Demise continued, but now it was fought by those who had chosen to remain behind the various tribes who refused to flee their ancestral lands and, most importantly, the Sheikah, who understood that their sacred calling required them to stand with their goddess regardless of personal cost. The battles that followed were unlike anything the surface world had ever witnessed. Conflicts so intense and fundamental that they seemed to take place on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The physical combat between warriors and demons was accompanied by spiritual struggles that determined the very nature of existence itself, while the landscape around these conflicts was permanently altered by the forces unleashed during the fighting. The Sheikah proved themselves worthy of their divine appointment during these terrible battles, their abilities growing and evolving under the pressure of ultimate necessity. Individual shadow folk discovered powers within themselves that they had never suspected, while the tribe as a whole developed new techniques and strategies that pushed the boundaries of what mortal beings could accomplish. They learned to channel divine energy through their own bodies, to manipulate the spiritual forces that connected all living things, and to perceive and interact with dimensions of reality that remained invisible to ordinary mortals. Yet for all their growing power and desperate courage, the forces of light continued to lose ground against Demise's relentless advance. The Demon King seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, feeding on the destruction and despair he had created, while his armies multiplied like a plague that consumed everything in its path. Even the goddess Hylia, despite her divine nature, began to show signs of the tremendous strain that the prolonged conflict was placing upon her. The turning point came when Hylia realized that conventional victory was impossible, that no amount of martial prowess or strategic brilliance could overcome the fundamental advantage that Demise possessed through his connection to the primal forces of destruction. The only way to defeat the Demon King was through a sacrifice so profound that it would reshape the very nature of the cosmic order, a gambit that would ensure ultimate victory while extracting a price that almost defied comprehension. The goddess made a decision that demonstrated both her love for the mortal realm and her understanding of the deepest mysteries of existence. She would give up her divine immortality, surrendering the eternal life that was her birthright, in order to create something entirely new, a mortal incarnation of her divine essence that would be able to wield the Triforce in ways that were impossible for purely divine or purely mortal beings. The transformation that Hylia underwent was not merely a change of form, but a fundamental alteration of her essential nature. She divided her consciousness, retaining enough of her divine awareness to continue guiding the war effort, while simultaneously creating a new form of existence that could bridge the gap between mortal and divine realms. This reincarnation would possess all the spiritual power necessary to defeat Demise, but it would also carry all the vulnerabilities and limitations that defined mortal existence. The decision required not only incredible courage, but also absolute faith in the eventual outcome of cosmic justice. Hylia could not know with certainty how long it might take for her mortal reincarnation to develop the strength and wisdom necessary to fulfill its destiny, nor could she predict what trials and tragedies might occur during the interim period. She was essentially gambling the fate of existence itself on her belief that love and courage would ultimately prove stronger than hatred and despair. With her divine transformation initiated, and her mortal incarnation beginning its journey toward eventual birth among the Sky Islands, the goddess had one final command to give to her most faithful servants. The Sheikah had proven their loyalty and devotion beyond any possible doubt, and now they would be asked to undertake the most important and difficult mission in their long history of sacred service. The mighty battle that had resulted in Demise's initial defeat for the combined forces of light had indeed managed to overcome the Demon King, though at tremendous cost had concluded with the ultimate evil being sealed away rather than destroyed completely. The seal was powerful, woven from divine energy, and reinforced by the sacrifice of countless heroes, but both Hylia and her Sheikah guardians understood that it was fundamentally temporary. Demise's essential nature as a force of primal destruction meant that he could not be permanently eliminated through any conventional means, and eventually the seal would weaken enough to allow his return. When that inevitable day arrived, the surface world would need to be ready. The mortal incarnation of the goddess would need guidance and protection as she grew to understand her true nature and developed the abilities necessary to wield the Triforce. Most importantly, someone would need to maintain constant vigilance over the sealed Demon King, watching for the first signs of his return and ensuring that the forces of light received adequate warning to prepare their defenses. This sacred duty fell to Impa, one of the most devoted and capable of all the Sheikah warriors, whose spiritual strength and unwavering loyalty made her the ideal choice for such a momentous responsibility. The assignment that the goddess gave to this faithful servant was both simple in its description and overwhelming in its implications. Watch over the seal that contained Demise, guard the master sword that had been forged to combat ultimate evil, and ensure that when the cosmic cycle inevitably brought the forces of darkness back to threaten the world, the champions of light would be ready to meet them. Impa accepted this charge with the same quiet dignity that had always characterized the Sheikah response to divine commands, understanding fully that she was agreeing to sacrifice not merely her own life, but potentially the lives of countless generations of her descendants who would inherit the responsibility she was accepting. The vigil she would maintain was not measured in years or even decades, but in the vast cycles of cosmic time that governed the eternal struggle between creation and destruction. The sacred site where Impa would maintain her eternal watch was itself a place of tremendous spiritual significance, a location where the boundary between the physical and divine realms was so thin that ordinary mortals could barely endure its presence. Here, surrounded by the symbols and artifacts that represented the deepest mysteries of existence, the faithful Sheikah guardian settled into a meditation that would span ages. Her consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations to encompass the spiritual currents that flowed through all reality. The Master Sword, that legendary blade forged from divine metal and tempered with sacred fire, rested before her like a sleeping dragon, waiting for the moment when it would be called upon to awaken and resume its eternal war against the forces of darkness. The weapon was more than mere metal and magic. It was the physical manifestation of the divine will to resist corruption, a tool that could cut through the very essence of evil while remaining pure and uncorrupted, no matter how many battles it fought. Yet even this mighty blade was not sufficient to guarantee victory against Demise when he eventually returned. The Master Sword could wound and weaken the Demon King, could seal him away for extended periods, but ultimate triumph would require the intervention of the goddess's mortal incarnation, wielding the complete Triforce. Until that destined hero appeared, all that the forces of light could hope for was to maintain the balance and prevent the sealed evil from breaking free prematurely. As Impa settled into her vigil and the immediate crisis passed, the surviving members of the Sheikah tribe began the long process of rebuilding and adaptation. They had lost many of their number during the Great War, and the surface world itself bore terrible scars that would take generations to heal. Yet they had also gained something precious through their trial by fire, absolute confirmation that their sacred calling was not merely traditional duty, but cosmic necessity. The Shadow Folk understood better than anyone that Demise's defeat was only temporary, that the great cycle of darkness and light would continue to turn until the end of time itself. Their role as guardians of the divine order had been proven through the ultimate test, and now they could prepare for the challenges that lay ahead with the confidence that comes from having already faced the worst that existence could offer and emerged victorious. The age of ancient conflict was drawing to a close, But the age of eternal vigilance was just beginning. In the depths of the sealed temple, Impa maintained her watch over the Master Sword and the imprisoned Demon King, her presence serving as a constant reminder that some duties transcended the normal limitations of mortal life. Above in the Sky Islands, human civilization continued to grow and develop, guided by the divine protection that had saved them from destruction, but unaware of the price that had been paid for their survival. The Sheikah, who remained on the surface, faced the daunting task of rebuilding not only their own communities but entire ecosystems that had been ravaged by demonic corruption. Yet they approached this work with the same methodical devotion that had characterized their response to the original crisis, understanding that healing the world was as much a part of their sacred duty as defending it had been. The Great War was over. The immediate threat had passed, and the cosmic order had been preserved for another age. But the faithful guardians who had made this victory possible knew that their vigil would continue until the very end of time, watching and waiting for the moment when darkness would rise again, and the eternal struggle would resume. In the quiet spaces between battles, in the peaceful years when evil slumbered and good seemed triumphant, the Sheikah maintained their readiness and passed down their knowledge to new generations who would one day face trials that their ancestors could barely imagine. The great victory against Demise and his demonic hordes had been achieved, but the cost of that triumph echoed through every aspect of existence, transforming not only the physical landscape of the surface world, but also the spiritual and cosmic order that governed all reality. The floating islands that had carried human civilization to safety in the sky above continued to drift through the clouds, their inhabitants gradually building new lives in their aerial sanctuary while remaining largely unaware of the tremendous changes taking place in the world below. Yet the surface realm, scarred and wounded though it was by the terrible conflict that had raged across its length and breadth, was far from abandoned or forgotten. In the quiet places where demonic corruption had not penetrated, in the hidden valleys and secret groves that had been protected by Sheikah magic and divine intervention, new forms of life were beginning to emerge and flourish. The victory of light over darkness had created opportunities for growth and renewal that would have been impossible during the long years of war and devastation. The faithful Impa maintained her eternal vigil over the sealed Master Sword and the imprisoned essence of Demise. Her consciousness expanded beyond normal mortal limitations to encompass the vast cycles of time that would govern the eventual return of cosmic balance. Her sacrifice had created a stable foundation upon which the forces of light could build their preparations for future challenges, while her spiritual presence served as a beacon of hope for all who understood the true nature of the struggle between creation and destruction. But Impa was not entirely alone in her sacred duty, for the other members of the Sheikah tribe had not simply vanished or abandoned their calling when the immediate crisis passed. Instead, they had adapted their ancient mission to meet the new realities of a world that was simultaneously wounded and renewed, where the old certainties had been shattered, but new possibilities were emerging with each passing day. The shadow folk who remained on the surface after the great exodus to the sky found themselves in a position that was both challenging and unprecedented. They were the inheritors of a world that had been fundamentally transformed by divine intervention and cosmic warfare, where the very laws of nature bore the marks of supernatural conflict, and where the spiritual energies that flowed through all existence had been permanently altered by the forces that had been unleashed during the struggle against ultimate evil. The physical landscape itself told the story of what had transpired during those terrible years of conflict. Great craters marked the spots where divine power had struck the earth, creating lakes of such perfect clarity that they seemed to hold fragments of heaven within their depths. Mountain ranges had been reshaped by the passage of supernatural armies, their peaks now forming patterns that corresponded to ancient symbols of protection and divine authority. Forests that had been burned to ash by demonic fire were slowly regenerating, but the trees that grew in these renewed woodlands possessed qualities that set them apart from any vegetation that had existed before the Great War. These changes were not merely superficial alterations to the surface of the world, but fundamental transformations in the very essence of reality itself. The boundary between the physical and spiritual realms had been permanently thinned in many locations, creating places where those with sufficient sensitivity could perceive echoes of divine presence, and where the accumulated wisdom of ages seemed to whisper from every stone and stream. For the Sheikah, whose spiritual abilities had always allowed them to perceive such subtle phenomena, these transformed landscapes became both opportunity and responsibility. They could see more clearly than ever before the intricate web of connections that bound all existence together, understand more fully the cosmic principles that govern the eternal struggle between order and chaos, and recognize more accurately the signs that would herald the eventual return of the forces they had fought so hard to defeat. The Shadow Folk began the great work of cultivation and restoration with the same methodical devotion that had characterized their approach to every aspect of their sacred calling. They were not merely seeking to repair the damage that had been done during the war, but to create something entirely new, a surface world that would be more beautiful, more harmonious, and more resistant to future corruption than anything that had existed before. This ambitious undertaking required them to draw upon knowledge and abilities that had been developed during the most desperate moments of the conflict, techniques that pushed the boundaries between mortal craft and divine miracle. The Sheikah had learned during the war to channel spiritual energy through their own bodies, to manipulate the fundamental forces that shaped reality, and to cooperate with the natural world in ways that transcended ordinary understanding of what was possible. They began by identifying the locations where spiritual energy flowed most strongly through the transformed landscape, mapping out patterns of power that corresponded to ancient symbols and cosmic principles. These nexus points became the foundation for a new kind of settlement, communities that were designed not merely for human habitation, but as instruments for focusing and directing the beneficial forces that had been released into the world during the divine intervention. The architecture that emerged from this process was unlike anything that had been constructed during the previous age of surface civilization. Buildings seemed to grow from the earth itself rather than being imposed upon it, their forms following the natural flow of spiritual energy, while incorporating defensive features that operated on both physical and metaphysical levels. These structures were simultaneously homes, fortresses, temples, and research facilities, each one serving multiple functions while contributing to the overall harmony of the communities they anchored. The Sheikah settlements became centers of learning and healing where refugees from the great conflict could find not only shelter and sustenance but also the spiritual guidance necessary to recover from the trauma they had experienced. The Shadow Folk had always understood that true healing required attention to more than just physical injuries, and in the transformed world that emerged after Demise's defeat, this wisdom became more crucial than ever before. Many of the survivors who made their way to these communities bore wounds that went far deeper than anything that could be treated with conventional medicine. They had witnessed the breakdown of the fundamental order of existence, seen their friends and families consumed by forces of pure malevolence, and endured experiences that challenged every assumption they had held about the nature of reality itself. The recovery from such trauma required not just time and care, but active intervention by those who understood the spiritual dimensions of suffering and healing. The Sheikah developed new techniques for treating these deeper wounds. methods that combined their ancient knowledge of spiritual healing with insights gained during their direct confrontation with cosmic forces of destruction. They learned to perceive and cleanse the lingering traces of demonic corruption that clung to some survivors, to restore the spiritual connections that had been severed by exposure to ultimate evil, and to help traumatized souls rediscover their place in the renewed cosmic order. Yet even as they focused on healing and restoration, the Shadow Folk never forgot that their primary calling was to serve as guardians of the divine order and protectors of the mortal realm against future threats. The victory against demise had been decisive, but not final, and they understood better than anyone that the great cycle of cosmic conflict would continue to turn until the end of time itself. The cultivation of the surface world therefore included extensive preparations for the challenges that would inevitably arise in future ages. The Sheikah established hidden caches throughout the renewed landscape, storing weapons, supplies, and knowledge that would be needed when darkness rose again to threaten the light. These repositories were concealed not merely through physical camouflage, but through spiritual techniques that would ensure they remained hidden until the proper time for their discovery arrived. More importantly, the Shadow Folk began the great work of preserving and expanding the accumulated wisdom that had been gained during their confrontation with ultimate evil. The techniques that had been developed during the desperate years of warfare, the insights that had emerged from direct exposure to cosmic forces, and the understanding that had been purchased through tremendous sacrifice were all carefully recorded and passed down to future generations who would one day need such knowledge to face their own trials. This process of preservation required the development of new methods for storing and transmitting information that went far beyond conventional writing or oral tradition. The Sheikah learned to encode knowledge within the very structure of their architectural works, to embed wisdom in the patterns of cultivation they used to shape the landscape, and to create teaching methods that could convey not just facts, but direct spiritual experience. The symbol of the tearing eye, which had always represented the dual nature of the Sheikah calling, took on new layers of meaning in the transformed world. The eye continued to represent their role as watchers and guardians, those who saw all and remained vigilant against emerging threats. But the tear now carried additional significance as well. It spoke of the sorrow that came from witnessing the suffering of others, the grief that accompanied the necessary sacrifices of warfare, and the compassion that motivated their continued service despite the personal costs such devotion required. As the years flowed past and the immediate wounds of the great conflict began to heal, the surface world gradually transformed into something that exceeded even the beauty and harmony of the previous golden age. The Sheikah cultivation had created landscapes of such breathtaking loveliness that they seemed to capture fragments of divine perfection within mortal forms, while their settlements became centers of learning and spiritual advancement that attracted pilgrims and scholars from throughout the known world. The various tribes that had fought alongside the Shadow Folk during the Great War began to establish their own communities in the renewed surface realm, but they did so in cooperation with Sheikah guidance rather than in isolation from it. The mountain people built their fortress cities in locations that complemented the spiritual geography mapped out by the Shadow Folk, while the forest dwellers established their woodland sanctuaries at points where natural beauty and defensive advantage combined to create havens of peace and safety. The integration of these different peoples into the renewed surface civilization was facilitated by the shared experience of having fought together against ultimate evil, but it was sustained by the deeper understanding that had emerged from that conflict regarding the interconnected nature of all existence. The Great War had revealed that no individual or tribe could stand alone against the cosmic forces that shaped reality, and that true security could only be achieved through cooperation based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The Sheikah served as natural mediators in this process, their spiritual insights allowing them to perceive the underlying harmony that connected seemingly disparate cultures and traditions. They helped resolve conflicts before they could escalate into violence, facilitated exchanges of knowledge and resources that benefited all parties, and provided the spiritual guidance that allowed diverse communities to find common ground in their shared commitment to protecting the renewed world they had helped create. Yet, even as they worked to build bridges between different peoples and cultures, the Shadow Folk maintained their unique identity and their special relationship with the divine realm. They continued to practice the subtle arts that had been their hallmark since the beginning of their calling, developing new applications for their abilities, while preserving the ancient traditions that connected them to their sacred origins. The prophecies and visions that had guided them during the Great Conflict continued to flow through their consciousness, providing glimpses of future challenges and opportunities that allowed them to prepare for contingencies that might not manifest for generations to come. These prophetic insights were not always clear or complete, for the divine realm communicated through symbols and metaphors rather than literal descriptions, but they provided enough guidance to ensure that the Shadow Folk could continue their eternal vigil with confidence and purpose. One of the most significant developments during this period of renewal and growth was the establishment of formal relationships between the Sheikah and the descendants of the goddess Hylia, who were beginning to emerge among the goddess Hylia, sky-dwelling refugees. The divine reincarnation that the goddess had created through her tremendous sacrifice was slowly taking shape across multiple generations, with each successive incarnation carrying forward a portion of the original divine essence, while also developing the mortal qualities necessary to eventually wield the Triforce. The connection between the Shadow Folk and these emerging carriers of divine heritage was not merely political or ceremonial, but spiritual and cosmic in its implications. The Sheikah had been chosen as guardians of the goddess from the very beginning of their calling, and that sacred duty now extended to protecting and guiding her mortal incarnations as they developed the wisdom and strength necessary to fulfill their ultimate destiny. This relationship required the development of new protocols and traditions that could accommodate the unique challenges posed by the goddess's transformed nature. The divine incarnations possessed tremendous spiritual potential, but also the vulnerabilities and limitations that characterized all mortal existence, creating a situation where they needed both protection and freedom, guidance and independence, support, and the opportunity to develop their own understanding of their sacred calling. The Sheikah approached this delicate responsibility with the same careful balance that had always characterized their service to the divine realm. They provided protection when it was needed, but remained invisible when their presence might interfere with necessary learning experiences. They offered guidance when it was sought, but never imposed their own interpretations of divine will upon those who carried the ultimate responsibility for cosmic decisions. As the surface world continued to flourish under the combined efforts of all its inhabitants, the renewed civilization began to attract the attention of those who still dwelt in the sky islands above. The floating sanctuaries had served their purpose during the Great Conflict, preserving human civilization from immediate destruction while the cosmic war raged below, but they had never been intended as permanent refuges from the mortal realm. The gradual return of sky dwellers to the surface world created new opportunities for cultural exchange and cooperation, but it also presented challenges that required careful management by those who understood both the transformed nature of the surface realm and the experiences that had shaped the aerial refugees during their long exile from their ancestral home. The Sheikah once again served as crucial intermediaries in this process, their spiritual abilities allowing them to perceive and address the fears and misconceptions that might otherwise have prevented successful reintegration. They helped the returning sky dwellers understand the changes that had taken place during their absence, while also learning from them about the innovations and adaptations that had developed during the years of aerial isolation. This process of reunion and reintegration was not merely a restoration of the previous status quo, but the creation of something entirely new, a civilization that combined the best aspects of both sky and surface cultures, while incorporating the hard-won wisdom that had been gained through direct confrontation with cosmic forces. The resulting society was more diverse, more resilient, and more spiritually advanced than anything that had existed before the Great Conflict. The kingdom that emerged from this process of renewal and integration bore the name Hyrule, marking its connection to the divine heritage that flowed through the descendants of the goddess, while also honoring the sacrifices that had made its existence possible. This was not merely a political entity, but a spiritual community bound together by shared purpose and mutual commitment to protecting the cosmic order that had been preserved through such tremendous cost. The Sheikah found their role in this new kingdom to be both familiar and transformed. Their ancient calling as guardians of the divine order now expanded to include responsibilities they had never imagined during the simpler days of their original appointment. They remained the watchers and protectors, the keepers of secret knowledge, and the defenders against threats both seen and unseen, but they also became the spiritual architects of a civilization that was consciously designed to embody the highest ideals of cosmic harmony. The establishment of Hyrule marked the beginning of a new age in the eternal struggle between light and darkness, an era when the forces of creation had gained a secure foothold in the mortal realm, while maintaining their connection to the divine sources of their ultimate strength. The Shadow Folk had played a crucial role in bringing this new age into being, and they would continue to serve as its guardians throughout all the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. In quiet moments between their many duties and responsibilities, the Sheikah would sometimes pause to contemplate the incredible journey that had brought them from their original divine appointment to their current position as guardians of a renewed world. They had witnessed the worst that cosmic evil could unleash and had emerged victorious through faith, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion to their sacred calling. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges that could not yet be clearly seen, but they faced whatever was to come with the confidence that came from having already passed through the ultimate test and proven themselves worthy of their goddess's trust. The golden age that had dawned with the establishment of Hyrule and the renewal of the surface world was destined to face its greatest test, not from external invasion or cosmic catastrophe, but from the very success that had made such prosperity possible in the first place. The Triforce, that sacred relic containing the combined essence of the three golden goddesses, remained the ultimate prize in existence. Its power to grant any wish, making it an irresistible temptation for those whose hearts harbored ambitions that transcended mortal limitations. The peace and stability that characterized the early years of Hyrule's existence had allowed civilization to flourish in ways that previous generations could barely have imagined. Trade routes connected distant communities across vast networks that spanned continents. Scholars preserved and expanded the accumulated knowledge of ages in great libraries that served as repositories of wisdom, and artists created works of such beauty that they seemed to capture fragments of divine inspiration within mortal materials. Yet this very prosperity contained within it the seeds of future conflict, for success breeds ambition, and ambition, when unchecked by wisdom and compassion, inevitably leads to the desire for power over others. As the generations passed and the memory of the Great War against Demise began to fade from living recollection into historical record, some among the various peoples of Hyrule began to cast covetous eyes upon the ultimate source of divine authority that remained hidden somewhere within the sacred realm. The Triforce had been placed beyond mortal reach by the goddess Hylia's sacrifice, protected by barriers both physical and spiritual that prevented unworthy souls from even approaching its resting place, much less claiming its incredible power for themselves. Yet the knowledge that such ultimate authority existed somewhere within their world was like a constant whisper in the minds of those who sought to rise above their ordained station in the cosmic order. These ambitious individuals came from all walks of life and all levels of society. Some were nobles who had inherited positions of authority, but found themselves dissatisfied with the limitations that divine law placed upon their exercise of power. Others were merchants whose success in trade had given them wealth beyond measure, but left them craving the respect and influence that could only come from wielding supernatural force. Still others were scholars whose deep study of ancient mysteries had revealed to them the theoretical possibilities that might be achieved by one who possessed the right to reshape reality according to their own will. What united all these disparate figures was not their backgrounds or their specific goals, but their shared belief that they could use the Triforce more wisely and more effectively than the cosmic order currently allowed. They convinced themselves that the restrictions placed upon its use were arbitrary limitations imposed by divine beings who had grown complacent in their eternal existence, failing to understand the needs and desires of mortals who faced the constant pressure of limited lifespans and uncertain futures. The first attempts to locate and claim the sacred relic were individual efforts, lone seekers who ventured into the wilderness armed with nothing but determination and half-understood fragments of ancient lore. These solitary quests invariably ended in failure, for the barriers protecting the Triforce had been designed by divine intelligence and could not be overcome through mortal cunning alone, no matter how clever or persistent the individual attempting might be. But failure bred collaboration, and collaboration bred conspiracy. As word of these unsuccessful attempts spread through the networks of ambitious souls who shared similar dreams of ultimate power, they began to realize that their individual limitations might be overcome through collective effort. Secret societies formed in the shadows of respectable civilization, their members bound together by oaths of mutual support and shared determination to claim the divine prize that had been denied to mortals for so long. These clandestine organizations drew their membership from across the spectrum of Hyrulean society, creating networks of influence that extended into every major institution and community throughout the kingdom. Noble houses found themselves divided between loyal servants of the crown and secret conspirators who plotted to overthrow the existing order. Merchant guilds became fronts for intelligence gathering and resource accumulation, while scholarly institutions provided the research and theoretical framework necessary to understand the cosmic forces that protected their ultimate objective. The growth of these shadow organizations did not go unnoticed by those whose sacred duty was to watch for threats to the divine order. The Sheikah, with their supernatural awareness and their deep understanding of spiritual currents that flowed through all existence, began to perceive the subtle signs of brewing conspiracy long before the plotters themselves realized how extensive their networks had become. Individual shadow folk reported strange disturbances in the flow of spiritual energy around certain locations, unexplained patterns of behavior among people who had previously shown no interest in matters of cosmic significance, and the appearance of ancient symbols and texts in places where such materials had no legitimate reason to exist. These isolated observations might have been dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation, but when viewed together they painted a picture of coordinated effort that extended far beyond anything that could be explained by normal political ambition or commercial rivalry. The Sheikah response to these emerging threats reflected the wisdom and restraint that had always characterized their approach to their sacred duties. Rather than moving immediately to suppress what they had discovered, they began their own careful investigation into the scope and nature of the conspiracy that was developing within their kingdom. They understood that premature action might drive the plotters deeper underground while failing to eliminate the fundamental problem, and that true security could only be achieved through comprehensive understanding of what they were facing. The Shadow Folk employed all of their considerable skills in gathering intelligence about the various secret societies and their interconnected plans. Using techniques of stealth and misdirection that had been perfected across generations of sacred service, they infiltrated the conspiracy networks, identified key leaders and their specific roles, and mapped out the complex web of relationships that bound the diverse groups together in their shared quest for ultimate power. What they discovered was both more extensive and more dangerous than even their worst fears had suggested. The conspiracy to claim the Triforce had evolved far beyond a simple treasure hunt into something approaching a coordinated rebellion against the cosmic order itself. The plotters had developed sophisticated theories about the nature of divine authority, convincing themselves that the current distribution of power was fundamentally unjust, and that they were justified in taking whatever steps might be necessary to correct what they saw as cosmic imbalance. More troubling still was the discovery that some members of these secret societies had begun experimenting with forms of magic and spiritual manipulation that pushed the boundaries of what mortals were meant to attempt. They had uncovered fragments of knowledge from the ancient war against demise, techniques that had been developed during humanity's darkest hour but were never intended for use in times of peace and prosperity. The application of such desperate measures to their current quest suggested that the conspirators were willing to risk consequences that extended far beyond their own lives and souls. The situation reached a critical point when the various secret societies finally achieved sufficient coordination to launch their ultimate gambit. Rather than continuing their fruitless attempts to locate the Triforce through conventional exploration, they had devised a plan that would bypass the divine protections entirely by forcibly opening a passage into the sacred realm itself, the dimensional space where the golden goddesses had placed their ultimate creation beyond mortal reach. The magical techniques required for such an audacious undertaking were both incredibly complex and fundamentally dangerous, requiring the simultaneous cooperation of hundreds of participants across multiple locations throughout Hyrule. The conspirators had spent years perfecting their methods, conducting smaller experiments that tested individual components of their overall strategy, while gradually building up the spiritual energy and material resources necessary for their final assault on divine authority. When the great ritual finally commenced, its effects were immediately apparent to anyone with even the slightest sensitivity to spiritual phenomena. The very fabric of reality began to strain under the pressure of forces that were never meant to interact in such concentrated intensity, while dimensional barriers that had stood unchanged since the creation of the world started to crack and weaken under the assault of massed human will, guided by forbidden knowledge. The Sheikah, despite all their preparation and understanding of what was coming, found themselves facing a crisis that exceeded even their considerable abilities to manage through conventional means. The conspiracy had achieved a level of coordination and spiritual power that transformed it from a threat to the existing political order into a danger to the fundamental structure of existence itself. If the conspirators succeeded in their attempt to breach the sacred realm, the consequences would extend far beyond the theft of divine power, to include the potential collapse of the barriers that kept the various dimensions of reality separate and stable. In this moment of ultimate crisis, the Shadow Folk were forced to make a decision that would have consequences reaching across all the ages to come. They could continue to work within the established order, reporting their discoveries to the royal authorities, and trusting in conventional military and political responses to address the threat But such an approach would almost certainly prove inadequate to deal with forces that operated on cosmic rather than merely terrestrial levels. Alternatively, they could take direct action themselves, using their own spiritual abilities and secret knowledge to counter the conspiracy through methods that matched the supernatural nature of the threat they faced. This approach offered a greater chance of success, but it would also require them to employ techniques and access power sources that had been forbidden since the end of the Great War, capabilities that carried within them the potential for corruption and abuse, if not handled with absolute wisdom and restraint. The decision that the Sheikah leadership ultimately reached reflected both their deep understanding of cosmic principles and their unwavering commitment to their sacred calling as guardians of the divine order. They recognized that conventional responses would be insufficient to address a threat of such magnitude, and that their duty to protect the world sometimes required them to take risks that other, less knowledgeable guardians might not fully understand or appreciate. The Shadow Folk began to prepare for direct intervention against the conspiracy, drawing upon reserves of knowledge and power that had been carefully preserved since the ancient conflict with Demise, but never used except in the most desperate circumstances. They understood that once they committed themselves to this course of action, there would be no turning back, and that the techniques they employed would inevitably attract attention and scrutiny from those who might not comprehend the necessity of their actions. The specific methods that the Sheikah chose to employ against the conspiracy reflected their deep understanding of both the spiritual forces involved and the psychological motivations that drove their opponents. Rather than attempting to match the conspirators' brute force approach to breaching dimensional barriers, they developed a more subtle strategy that would work with existing cosmic principles rather than against them. The Shadow Folk had always understood that the most effective way to defeat darkness was not through direct confrontation, but through the restoration of natural balance and harmony. They began to weave counterspells and protective barriers around the locations where the conspiracy was conducting its most dangerous experiments, not with the goal of simply blocking their efforts, but with the intention of redirecting the spiritual energies being raised toward purposes that would strengthen rather than weaken the cosmic order. This approach required incredibly precise timing and coordination, for the forces involved were so powerful that even minor miscalculations could result in catastrophic consequences. Individual Sheikah warriors positioned themselves at key spiritual nexus points throughout the kingdom, using their own life force to anchor protective fields that would contain and redirect the energies being unleashed by the conspiracy's magical workings. The great ritual that the conspirators had spent years preparing reached its climax during a night when the celestial alignments were particularly favorable for their purposes. The combined gravitational influences of sun, moon, and planets creating conditions that would theoretically make it easier to breach the barriers protecting the sacred realm. They had chosen their moment well, for the same cosmic forces that aided their primary objective also made it more difficult for their opponents to counter their efforts through conventional spiritual techniques. Yet the Sheikah had anticipated this tactical advantage and had prepared accordingly, developing methods that could function effectively even under the challenging conditions that the conspirators had selected for their final gambit. As the various secret societies began their synchronized assault on divine authority, the Shadow Folk launched their own coordinated response, their protective measures unfolding across the kingdom like a vast web of spiritual energy designed to contain and neutralize the forces being raised against the cosmic order. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had been witnessed since the ancient war against Demise, a conflict fought primarily on spiritual and dimensional levels that remained largely invisible to ordinary mortals, even as its effects rippled through every aspect of reality. The conspirators pushed their magical techniques to their absolute limits, pouring centuries of accumulated energy and knowledge into their attempt to achieve what no mortal group had ever accomplished before. For a brief, terrifying moment, it appeared that they might actually succeed. The dimensional barriers protecting the sacred realm began to crack and weaken under their sustained assault, allowing glimpses of divine power to leak through into the mortal world. The very air around their ritual sites began to shimmer with energies that had never been meant to exist in such concentrated form outside the realm of the gods themselves. But even as the conspirators celebrated what they believed to be their impending triumph, the Sheikah countermeasures began to take effect. The protective barriers that the shadow folk had woven around the ritual sites started to contract and compress, containing the unleashed energies within increasingly smaller spaces, while simultaneously redirecting their flow according to principles that served the cosmic order rather than challenging it. The result was not the violent explosion of conflicting forces that many observers had feared, but something far more subtle and ultimately more effective. The spiritual energies that the conspirators had raised through their forbidden techniques were gradually transformed and purified, their destructive potential converted into forces that actually strengthened the barriers they had been intended to breach. The conspirators found themselves trapped within their own magical workings, unable to stop the processes they had initiated, but equally unable to control or direct them toward their intended goals. The power they had sought to steal from the gods was slowly turning back upon them, not as punishment or revenge, but as the natural consequence of attempting to manipulate forces they had never truly understood. The great conspiracy collapsed, not through military defeat or political suppression, but through the inexorable operation of cosmic justice, as the spiritual laws that governed existence reasserted their authority over those who had sought to circumvent divine will. The various secret societies that had worked for so long toward their shared goal of claiming ultimate power found their networks exposed and their members scattered, their years of careful planning rendered meaningless by forces that transcended mortal comprehension. In the aftermath of this crisis, the Kingdom of Hyrule was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of ambition and the dangers that could arise from unchecked desire for power. The conspiracy had drawn its membership from every level of society and every community throughout the realm, revealing that the temptation to transgress divine boundaries was not limited to any particular group or social class, but was instead a universal weakness that required constant vigilance to prevent. The Sheikah, having successfully defended the cosmic order against its greatest internal threat since the establishment of the kingdom, found themselves in a position that was both vindicated and complicated. Their intervention had been crucial to preventing a catastrophe that could have destroyed not just Hyrule, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. Yet their methods had also revealed the extent of their hidden knowledge and capabilities in ways that made some observers uncomfortable. The Shadow Folk understood that their role as guardians of the divine order sometimes required them to act in ways that might appear mysterious or even threatening to those who did not fully comprehend the cosmic principles involved. They had always accepted this burden as part of their sacred calling, but the events of the Great Conspiracy had made their unique position within the kingdom more visible and prominent than they had ever intended. As the immediate crisis passed and the kingdom began the process of recovery and renewal that would be necessary to heal the spiritual wounds left by the conspiracy, the Sheikah quietly returned to their traditional roles as watchers and protectors, hoping that their dramatic intervention would soon fade from public memory and allow them to resume their preferred position of invisible vigilance. Yet they also understood that the fundamental issues that had given rise to the conspiracy remained unresolved, that the temptation to seek ultimate power would continue to exist as long as mortals possessed ambition and free will. The great test had been passed, but it had also revealed that the eternal struggle between light and darkness could manifest in forms that were far more subtle and dangerous than the obvious threats posed by supernatural invasion or cosmic catastrophe. The shadow folk continued their vigil with the knowledge that their greatest challenges might come not from external enemies, but from the darkness that could grow within the very civilization they had sworn to protect, requiring them to remain ever watchful against threats that might emerge from the most unexpected sources and take forms that defied conventional understanding of conflict and resolution. The successful defeat of the Great Conspiracy had preserved the cosmic order and protected the sacred realm from violation, but the methods employed by the Sheikah in achieving this victory carried consequences that would reshape the destiny of the shadow folk in ways that none could have anticipated. The spiritual techniques they had used to counter the conspirators' assault on divine authority had necessarily drawn upon the same forbidden knowledge that had made the threat so dangerous in the first place, creating a situation where the guardians of cosmic balance found themselves wielding powers that others might view as equally threatening to the established order. The intervention that had saved the kingdom from catastrophe had not gone unnoticed by those in positions of earthly authority, for while the battle itself had been fought primarily on spiritual and dimensional levels invisible to ordinary perception, its effects had rippled through every aspect of reality in ways that could not be entirely concealed. Strange lights had danced across the night sky during the climactic confrontation. Temporal distortions had caused clocks and calendars throughout the realm to display impossible readings, and sensitive individuals in every community had reported dreams and visions that spoke of cosmic forces in conflict. More troubling still, from the perspective of those who governed through conventional political means, was the growing awareness that the Sheikah possessed capabilities that extended far beyond anything they had previously revealed or acknowledged. The shadow folk had always been known as skilled warriors, wise counselors, and devoted servants of the royal family, but the events surrounding the conspiracy had demonstrated that their true abilities operated on levels that transcended normal human understanding and challenged fundamental assumptions about the distribution of power within the kingdom. The reaction to these revelations was not immediate or uniform, for the various groups and individuals who had witnessed or been affected by the Sheikah intervention needed time to process what they had experienced and to understand its implications for their own positions within the established order. Some viewed the shadow folk's actions as heroic service that had prevented unimaginable catastrophe, while others saw them as evidence of hidden agendas and concealed power that might pose future threats to conventional authority. The most significant and ultimately most consequential response came from those Sheikah who had participated directly in the Great Intervention, for they had been forced to confront aspects of their own heritage and capabilities that had been carefully concealed even from themselves for generations beyond counting. The techniques they had employed to counter the conspiracy's assault on the sacred realm were not merely advanced applications of their traditional abilities, but represented access to forces and knowledge that had been deliberately suppressed since the end of the ancient war against Demisa. These revelations created deep philosophical and practical divisions within the Sheikah community itself, as different factions interpreted the implications of their enhanced understanding in fundamentally different ways. Some believed that their successful defense of the cosmic order proved that they were meant to take a more active and visible role in governing the kingdom, using their superior wisdom and capabilities to guide less enlightened mortals toward greater harmony with divine will. Others maintained that their traditional approach of invisible service and hidden influence remained the most appropriate way to fulfill their sacred calling, arguing that the recent crisis had been an exceptional situation that justified extraordinary measures but did not establish a precedent for ongoing changes in their relationship with the broader community. They feared that increased visibility and acknowledgement of their true capabilities would inevitably lead to the kind of fear and suspicion that could undermine the trust upon which their effectiveness depended. A third faction, smaller but more radical in its thinking, began to question whether their loyalty to the existing political order was truly compatible with their higher duty to protect the cosmic balance. They had seen how easily respected members of Hyrulean society had been corrupted by ambition and led into conspiracy against divine authority, and they wondered whether the very structures of conventional government might be fundamentally flawed in ways that made such corruption inevitable. These internal debates within the Sheikah community were conducted with the same careful discretion that had always characterized the Shadow Folk's approach to sensitive matters, but they could not be entirely concealed from external observation. Subtle changes in behavior patterns, shifts in the distribution of individual Sheikah throughout the kingdom, and variations in their responses to routine requests for counsel and assistance all provided clues that careful observers could interpret as signs of internal division and uncertainty. The most immediate and visible consequence of the Sheikah intervention was the discovery and exposure of additional conspirators who had not been directly involved in the Great Ritual, but had supported it through various forms of material and logistical assistance. The spiritual energies unleashed during the confrontation had left traces that allowed the Shadow Folk to track down every individual who had contributed to the conspiracy in any meaningful way, creating a comprehensive map of corruption that extended throughout the kingdom's political, economic, and social structures. The process of identifying and apprehending these additional conspirators required the Sheikah to work closely with conventional law enforcement and judicial authorities, exposing them to scrutiny and questioning that they had traditionally avoided through their preference for operating in the shadows. This increased visibility revealed not only their remarkable investigative capabilities, but also their access to information and resources that ordinary citizens had no way of obtaining through legal means. The trials and interrogations that followed the exposure of the extended conspiracy network created additional complications, for many of the accused individuals possessed detailed knowledge of Sheikah methods and capabilities that they had observed during the investigation process. Some of these former conspirators, motivated by bitterness over their exposure and prosecution, began to share this sensitive information with others who had not been involved in the original plot, but harbored their own concerns about the Shadow Folk's hidden influence. As word of the Sheikah's true capabilities spread through informal networks of gossip and speculation, public perception of the Shadow Folk began to shift in ways that created new challenges for their traditional approach to their sacred calling. Where they had once been viewed as mysterious but generally benevolent servants of the crown, they were increasingly seen as a potential threat to individual freedom and conventional authority, possessed of powers that could be used to spy upon, manipulate, or control ordinary citizens without their knowledge or consent. These changing perceptions were exacerbated by the discovery of various Sheikah facilities and resources that had remained hidden throughout the kingdom, their locations revealed either through the spiritual disturbances caused by the Great Intervention or through information extracted from captured conspirators who had stumbled upon them during their own forbidden researches. Ancient training grounds, hidden libraries, secret communication networks, and concealed weapon caches all came to light, painting a picture of an organization that was far more extensive and well prepared than anyone had previously suspected. The most disturbing discovery, from the perspective of those who governed through conventional means, was the extent to which the Sheikah had been monitoring and influencing political decisions throughout the kingdom's history. Records found in their secret archives revealed that the Shadow Folk had been aware of and had taken steps to counter numerous potential threats to stability and order, many of which had never become public knowledge because Sheikah intervention had prevented them from developing into actual crises. While this evidence demonstrated the dedication and effectiveness with which the shadow folk had served their protective function, it also raised troubling questions about the nature of consent and democratic governance in a kingdom where crucial decisions were being influenced by an organization that operated outside normal channels of accountability, oversight. Even those who benefited from Sheikah protection began to wonder whether such comprehensive surveillance and manipulation was compatible with the principles of freedom and self-determination that they believed should govern civilized society. The growing awareness of Sheikah capabilities and methods created a climate of suspicion and unease that affected every level of society, from individual citizens who wondered whether their private conversations were being monitored to high-ranking officials who questioned whether their policy decisions were truly their own or were being subtly guided by hidden influences. This atmosphere of uncertainty and mistrust was exactly what the shadow folk had always sought to avoid through their traditional approach of invisible service. But the exceptional circumstances of the recent crisis had made such concealment impossible. The situation was further complicated by the emergence of evidence suggesting that some Sheikah had been using their abilities for purposes that went beyond their legitimate protective duties, engaging in activities that served their own interests or those of particular individuals rather than the broader good of the kingdom. While such incidents appeared to be relatively isolated exceptions rather than systematic abuse, they provided additional ammunition for critics who argued that no group should possess such power without appropriate oversight and accountability. The royal family found itself in a particularly difficult position as these revelations and concerns continued to accumulate, for their own authority and legitimacy depended partly upon their historical association with the Sheikah and the protection that the shadow folk had provided throughout the ages. They could not simply denounce or distance themselves from their traditional guardians without undermining the foundations of their own power. Yet they also could not ignore the growing demands for action to address the perceived threat that unrestricted Sheikah capabilities posed to conventional governance. The debate that emerged within the highest levels of government reflected broader societal tensions between security and freedom, between the need for protection against genuine threats and the desire to maintain individual autonomy and democratic accountability. Some advisors argued that the recent crisis had demonstrated the vital importance of Sheikah capabilities and that any restrictions on their activities would leave the kingdom vulnerable to future attacks from forces that conventional, military, and political responses could not effectively counter. Others contended that the concentration of such power in the hands of any single group, no matter how well-intentioned or historically loyal, represented a fundamental threat to the principles upon which legitimate government was based. They argued that the Sheikah's own success in preventing various threats from becoming public knowledge had created a situation where their protective value could not be properly assessed against the risks their capabilities posed to democratic governance and individual freedom. The complexity of these issues was compounded by the fact that many of the most crucial decisions had to be made by individuals who lacked the specialized knowledge necessary to fully understand the implications of their choices. The spiritual and cosmic dimensions of the Sheikah's work operated according to principles that were largely incomprehensible to those who had not devoted their lives to such studies, making it difficult for conventional political leaders to evaluate the necessity and appropriateness of various shadow folk methods and capabilities. As the debate continued and pressure for decisive action mounted, a consensus gradually emerged around the idea that some form of restriction or regulation of Sheikah activities was necessary to restore public confidence in the kingdom's governance. even if such measures might potentially compromise the effectiveness of the shadow folk's protective function. The specific nature and extent of these restrictions became the subject of intense negotiation between royal advisors, military leaders, and representatives of various civilian interests. The Sheikah themselves were not excluded from these discussions, but their participation was complicated by their own internal divisions regarding the appropriate response to the changing political climate. The faction that favored increased visibility and acknowledgement of their role argued for cooperation with regulatory efforts as a way of legitimizing their activities and securing formal recognition of their importance to the kingdom's security. The traditionalist faction opposed any form of external oversight or restriction, maintaining that their sacred calling transcended earthly political considerations, and that any attempt to regulate their activities would ultimately prove counterproductive to the very goals that such regulation was intended to serve. They argued that the shadow folk's effectiveness depended upon their ability to operate with complete freedom and flexibility, adapting their methods to meet evolving threats without being constrained by bureaucratic procedures or political considerations. The most radical faction saw the growing suspicion and hostility as evidence that their relationship with conventional authority had become fundamentally untenable, and they began to advocate for more dramatic changes that would either establish their independence from earthly governance or create new forms of political organization that could accommodate their unique capabilities and responsibilities. The resolution that ultimately emerged from these complex negotiations represented a compromise that satisfied none of the major factions completely, but provided a framework that most could accept as preferable to continued uncertainty and conflict. The shadow folk would be permitted to continue their traditional protective activities, but with significant restrictions on their methods and scope of operations, enhanced oversight mechanisms to ensure accountability, and formal procedures for addressing complaints and concerns about their conduct. Most significantly, the agreement established clear boundaries between activities that were considered legitimate exercises of their protective function and those that were deemed to exceed appropriate limits on their authority. The Sheikah would retain access to their traditional abilities and knowledge, but would be prohibited from using them for purposes that went beyond their core mission of defending the kingdom against threats to its security and stability. The implementation of these new restrictions required the shadow folk to make fundamental changes to their traditional methods and organizational structure, adaptations that proved more difficult and disruptive than either side had anticipated during the negotiation process. Centuries of accumulated practices and procedures had to be modified or abandoned, while new systems of documentation and accountability had to be developed to satisfy the oversight requirements that had been established. More challenging still was the psychological and spiritual adaptation required of individual Sheikah who had spent their entire lives operating according to principles that were now being questioned or rejected by the society they had devoted themselves to protecting. Many found it difficult to reconcile their understanding of their sacred calling with the practical limitations that were being imposed upon their ability to fulfill that calling effectively. The most profound consequence of these changes was the gradual emergence of a fundamental schism within the Sheikah community itself. As different individuals and groups responded to the new restrictions in ways that reflected their deepest beliefs about the nature of their duties and the appropriate relationship between their spiritual calling and their earthly obligations. This division would prove to have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis that had precipitated it, creating fault lines within the shadow folk community that would eventually reshape the entire history of their people. The restrictions and oversight mechanisms that had been imposed upon the Sheikah in the aftermath of the Great Conspiracy created an environment of enforced cooperation and regulated activity that was fundamentally at odds with the shadow folk's traditional methods of invisible service and autonomous action. Yet this period of constrained operation, difficult and frustrating, though it proved to be for many among the ancient guardians, also provided unexpected opportunities for growth and development in directions that had been neglected during the long centuries of their primary focus on protective and defensive responsibilities. The formal documentation requirements that had been established as part of the new oversight system forced the Sheikah to create comprehensive records of their activities, techniques, and accumulated knowledge in ways that had never been necessary when they operated entirely in the shadows. This process of systematic organization and preservation revealed the true extent of the wisdom they had accumulated across generations of sacred service, much of which had previously existed only in the form of oral traditions passed down through master-student relationships or fragmentary notes scattered across various hidden repositories. The creation of these formal archives became a project that engaged virtually every member of the Sheikah community, as elder masters worked alongside younger apprentices to translate ancient oral teachings into written form, while simultaneously developing new methods of classification and cross-reference that would make the accumulated knowledge more accessible to future generations. The process required them to articulate concepts and principles that had always been understood intuitively, to describe techniques that had been learned through direct experience rather than theoretical study, and to explain the spiritual and cosmic foundations that underlay their most sophisticated abilities. This great work of documentation and preservation revealed connections and patterns that had not been apparent when the knowledge existed in isolated fragments, distributed among different specialists and lineages. Techniques that had been developed independently by different branches of the shadow folk were found to share common principles that suggested deeper underlying truths about the nature of reality and the proper methods for interacting with spiritual forces. Seemingly unrelated areas of study proved to be complementary aspects of more comprehensive systems of understanding that had been partially obscured by the compartmentalized way in which traditional Sheikah education had been structured. The collaborative nature of the documentation project also fostered new relationships and exchanges of knowledge between Sheikah specialists who had previously worked in relative isolation from one another. Masters of stealth and infiltration found themselves learning from experts in spiritual healing and divination, while scholars of ancient languages and symbols discovered practical applications for their theoretical knowledge through cooperation with craftsmen and engineers who had developed sophisticated tools and devices. These unexpected benefits of the enforced reorganization were most apparent in the area of technological and magical innovation, where the combination of diverse expertise and systematic documentation led to breakthroughs that exceeded anything the shadow folk had achieved during their previous centuries of independent operation. The restrictions that prevented them from using their traditional methods of subtle influence and hidden manipulation forced them to develop new approaches that were both more transparent in their operation and more sophisticated in their underlying principles. The most significant development during this period was the creation of what would later be known as the Trinity of Truths, a set of 3 interconnected artifacts that represented the pinnacle of Sheikah achievement in the harmonious combination of spiritual wisdom and technical craftsmanship. These devices were not merely tools or weapons, but instruments of enlightenment that could reveal hidden aspects of reality, while simultaneously protecting their users from the corrupting influences that often accompanied access to such profound knowledge. The lens of truth emerged from research into the nature of perception and the methods by which conscious beings interpret and understand the information provided by their senses. The Sheikah had long understood that reality contained layers of meaning and significance that remained invisible to ordinary observation. But their traditional techniques for perceiving these hidden dimensions had relied upon intensive training and natural talent that made them accessible only to a small number of specially gifted individuals. The lens represented a revolutionary breakthrough in making such enhanced perception available to anyone who possessed the wisdom and moral foundation necessary to use it responsibly. The device could reveal illusions and deceptions regardless of their source, whether they originated from deliberate magical manipulation, natural phenomena that created misleading impressions, or the psychological biases and limitations that affected all conscious perception. More profoundly, the lens could perceive the spiritual and emotional resonances that connected all living beings, making visible the networks of influence and relationship that shaped individual behavior and collective social dynamics. This capability made it an invaluable tool for identifying sources of corruption and manipulation before they could cause significant damage, while also providing insights into the underlying causes of conflict and discord that might otherwise remain mysterious. The creation of the lens required not only advanced technical knowledge, but also deep spiritual understanding of the principles that governed consciousness and perception. The Sheikah craftsman who forged its crystal components had to maintain perfect spiritual balance throughout the creation process, for any trace of selfish desire or corrupted intention would render the finished device ineffective or even dangerous to its users. The mask of truth represented a complementary achievement in the realm of communication and understanding, addressing the fundamental problem of how conscious beings could share knowledge and experience across the barriers created by individual perspective and limited language. The shadow folk had always recognized that truth was often distorted or lost entirely when it passed through the medium of ordinary speech and conventional social interaction. But their traditional solutions to this problem had relied upon intensive training and shared cultural understanding that made effective communication possible only within their own community. The mask created a form of enhanced empathic connection that allowed its wearer to perceive not only the literal meaning of spoken words, but also the emotional and spiritual context that gave those words their true significance. This deeper level of communication could reveal hidden motivations, unspoken fears, and unconscious beliefs that influence behavior in ways that the speakers themselves might not fully understand. Perhaps most importantly, the mask could distinguish between deliberate deception and unconscious self-delusion, a capability that proved invaluable for identifying individuals who had been corrupted by external influences or who had fallen victim to their own psychological limitations and blind spots. This made it an essential tool for maintaining the spiritual and moral health of communities and organizations, allowing problems to be addressed before they developed into serious threats to stability and harmony. The Stone of Agony completed the Trinity by addressing the challenge of detecting and responding to sources of genuine spiritual distress and supernatural threat that might not be apparent through ordinary sensory observation or conventional investigation methods. The Sheikah had always possessed individuals with natural sensitivity to such phenomena, but these gifts were distributed unevenly among the population and could be unreliable under certain conditions or when confronted with particularly subtle or sophisticated forms of spiritual manipulation. The stone created a reliable and consistent method for detecting the presence of malevolent spiritual forces, cursed objects, corrupted individuals, and other sources of supernatural danger that posed threats to both individual souls and collective well-being. The device responded to such threats through physical vibrations that could be felt by its bearer, providing early warning of dangers that might otherwise remain undetected until they had already caused significant harm. The creation of the stone required the most advanced understanding of spiritual mechanics and metaphysical principles, for it had to be attuned to the fundamental frequencies that distinguished beneficial, spiritual influences from harmful ones, without becoming vulnerable to deception or manipulation by sophisticated adversaries who might attempt to mask their true nature. The development of the Trinity of Truths was accompanied by parallel advances in other areas of Sheikah craftsmanship and engineering, including the creation of the hover boots that would allow their wearers to move across surfaces and through environments that would normally be inaccessible to terrestrial beings. These remarkable devices represented a synthesis of spiritual levitation techniques with mechanical engineering principles, creating a form of enhanced mobility that expanded the operational capabilities of shadowfolk agents while also providing new possibilities for exploration and investigation in previously unreachable locations. The hover boots were particularly valuable for accessing ancient ruins and forgotten sites that might contain important historical information or dangerous artifacts that required careful study and secure storage. They also proved useful for conducting surveillance and reconnaissance operations in urban environments where traditional climbing and stealth techniques might be compromised by architectural features or security measures that had been specifically designed to counter conventional infiltration methods. The technological and magical innovations developed during this period of enforced transparency and documentation represented only the most visible aspects of a broader transformation in Sheikah culture and philosophy that would have profound implications for their future role in the kingdom and their relationship with the forces they had sworn to protect. The collaborative research projects and systematic knowledge preservation efforts had created new forms of scholarly community and intellectual exchange that transcended the traditional boundaries between different specializations and lineages within the shadowfolk hierarchy. This intellectual renaissance was accompanied by a corresponding evolution in spiritual understanding and practice, as the enforced interaction between different schools of thought and technique led to the development of more sophisticated and comprehensive approaches to the challenges of maintaining cosmic balance and protecting divine order. The restrictions that had initially seemed to limit their effectiveness had ultimately forced them to develop new methods that were actually superior to their previous approaches in many important respects. The Shadow Temple, which had been established during the early years of Hyrule's existence as a place of rest and remembrance for fallen Sheikah warriors and members of the royal family, was expanded and redesigned during this period to serve as both a repository for the new archives and a center for advanced training in the enhanced techniques that were being developed. The temple's architecture was modified to incorporate the latest understanding of spiritual mechanics and metaphysical principles, creating spaces that could amplify and focus the subtle energies necessary for the most sophisticated forms of shadowfolk practice. The redesigned temple became a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was deliberately thinned, allowing advanced practitioners to access forms of knowledge and ability that would normally require years of intensive meditation and training to achieve. This made it possible to accelerate the education of new generations of Sheikah, while also providing a sanctuary where the most sensitive and dangerous research could be conducted without risking harm to the broader community. The temple's deeper chambers housed not only the formal archives that documented centuries of accumulated wisdom, but also practical laboratories where new techniques could be tested and refined under controlled conditions. These facilities represented the most advanced magical and spiritual research capabilities that had ever been assembled in one location, rivaling, and in some respects, surpassing the achievements of the ancient civilization that had first established the foundations of Sheikah knowledge and practice. Yet the Shadow Temple also served a more somber purpose, for it contained within its deepest vaults the physical and spiritual remains of various threats and challenges that the Sheikah had encountered and overcome throughout their long history of service. Cursed artifacts that were too dangerous to destroy but too important to abandon were stored in specially prepared chambers where their malevolent influences could be contained and studied. The preserved forms of corrupted beings that had been defeated in spiritual combat were maintained in states of suspended animation that allowed their nature and capabilities to be analyzed without risking their return to active malevolence. This repository of dangerous knowledge and materials represented both a resource for future research and a constant reminder of the prices that had been paid for the security and prosperity that the kingdom enjoyed. The shadow folk who worked in these deeper chambers did so with full awareness that they were handling forces that could destroy them if their vigilance or understanding proved inadequate. Yet they accepted these risks as part of their sacred duty to protect others from threats that conventional authorities could not comprehend or counter. The combination of advanced research facilities, comprehensive archives, and secure storage for dangerous materials made the Shadow Temple the most important single location in the Sheikah community's infrastructure, but it also created a concentration of power and knowledge that some among the shadow folk found troubling. The traditional distribution of expertise and responsibility across multiple hidden sites and independent lineages had provided natural protection against the corruption or compromise of any single individual or group, but the centralized approach that had emerged during the period of enforced documentation created new vulnerabilities that required careful consideration and planning to address. These concerns proved to be prophetic, for the very success of the Sheikah Renaissance and the impressive achievements it produced would eventually become sources of suspicion and fear among those who observed them from outside the shadow folk community. The visible evidence of capabilities that exceeded anything that had been previously known or suspected created new forms of political and social tension that would ultimately lead to consequences far more severe than any that had resulted from their traditional approach of invisible service and hidden influence. The period of relative peace and intellectual flourishing that had allowed the shadow folk to develop their most sophisticated techniques and create their most remarkable artifacts was drawing to a close, though few among them recognized the signs of approaching change or understood how quickly their circumstances could be transformed by forces that operated according to principles very different from those that governed their own spiritual and scholarly pursuits. The period of intellectual renaissance and technological advancement that had characterized the Sheikah's adaptation to their new circumstances was destined to face its most severe test, not from external threats or cosmic catastrophes, but from the darkest impulses that could emerge from within their own community, when wisdom became corrupted by pride and knowledge was perverted into an instrument of personal ambition rather than sacred service. The very achievements that had demonstrated the shadow folk's remarkable capacity for growth and innovation would become the foundation for a tragedy that would shake their civilization to its core and forever alter the nature of their relationship with the divine order they had sworn to protect. The transformation began subtly, manifesting first as philosophical disagreements and scholarly debates that seemed to represent nothing more than the natural, intellectual ferment that accompanies any period of rapid advancement and discovery. Individual Sheikah researchers and practitioners began to develop divergent interpretations of the ancient texts and traditional teachings that had always provided the spiritual foundation for their community's understanding of its sacred calling and cosmic responsibilities. Some of these emerging schools of thought questioned whether the restrictions that had been imposed upon their activities following the Great Conspiracy were truly necessary, or whether they represented an unjust limitation on their ability to fulfill their divine mandate effectively. Others went further, suggesting that the very concept of divine authority might be less absolute and unchangeable than traditional doctrine had always maintained, and that sufficiently advanced mortals might possess the wisdom and capability to improve upon cosmic arrangements that had been established in ages past. These intellectual challenges to established orthodoxy were accompanied by practical experiments that pushed the boundaries of what the shadow folk had traditionally considered acceptable uses of their abilities and knowledge. Individual researchers began to explore techniques and applications that had been forbidden or discouraged by previous generations of masters, justifying their investigations as necessary steps in the advancement of understanding that would ultimately benefit their entire community. The most troubling of these experimental programs focused on the nature of divine power itself and the theoretical possibility of accessing or redirecting such forces for purposes that transcended their traditional protective and defensive applications. Some Sheikah scholars became convinced that their people's long history of faithful service and their demonstrated mastery of spiritual and metaphysical principles had earned them the right to a more active role in shaping the cosmic order according to their own understanding of justice and wisdom. The individual who would eventually become the focal point for these dangerous trends was a Sheikah of exceptional talent and intelligence, whose early career had been marked by brilliant contributions to the community's understanding of advanced spiritual mechanics and metaphysical engineering. Bongo Bongo, as he came to be known, possessed natural abilities that exceeded those of most of his contemporaries, combined with an insatiable curiosity about the deepest mysteries of existence that drove him to pursue knowledge and power, regardless of the risks or ethical implications involved. Bongo Bongo's initial research had focused on legitimate areas of inquiry that were well within the established boundaries of acceptable Sheikah scholarship, but his exceptional results and growing reputation had gradually given him access to restricted materials and forbidden techniques that previous generations had deemed too dangerous for general study. The combination of his remarkable abilities and his exposure to knowledge that had been carefully limited for good reasons created a situation where his intellectual pride began to overcome his spiritual wisdom, and his personal ambitions started to eclipse his commitment to the sacred principles that had always guided Sheikah conduct. The specific turning point in Bongo Bongo's development came when he gained unauthorized access to one of the most important artifacts in the Shadow Temple's collection, the lens of truth that had been created during the earlier period of technological innovation and collaborative research. Rather than using the device for its intended purposes of revealing hidden threats and clarifying spiritual understanding, he began to experiment with ways of modifying and enhancing its capabilities for applications that had never been intended by its original creators. The lens of truth had been designed as an instrument of enlightenment and protection, but in Bongo Bongo's hands it became a tool for penetrating secrets that were meant to remain hidden and accessing forms of knowledge that carried with them inevitable corruption for any mortal consciousness that attempted to comprehend them fully. The device's ability to perceive the underlying spiritual structures that connected all existence could be perverted into a method for manipulating those same structures for personal advantage, transforming an instrument of truth into a weapon of deception and control. As Bongo Bongo's experiments grew more ambitious and his methods became increasingly divorced from traditional ethical constraints, his behavior began to change in ways that were apparent to those who knew him well. The brilliant scholar and dedicated researcher gradually transformed into something darker and more dangerous, his exceptional abilities now serving purposes that contradicted everything the Sheikah community claimed to represent. The first signs of serious trouble came when other researchers began to report that materials and artifacts were disappearing from supposedly secure locations within the Shadow Temple complex, vanishing without explanation. Despite the sophisticated protective measures that were supposed to prevent unauthorized access, these thefts were conducted with such skill and subtlety that they might have gone undetected entirely, if not for the meticulous record-keeping systems that had been established during the period of enforced documentation, oversight. The pattern of missing items suggested that someone with intimate knowledge of the temple's security arrangements and storage procedures was systematically acquiring resources for purposes that required careful concealment from community oversight. The thefts focused primarily on artifacts and materials related to spiritual manipulation and metaphysical engineering, creating a collection of tools and components that could theoretically be used to construct devices or perform rituals of tremendous power and questionable purpose. The investigation that was launched to identify the source of these thefts was hampered by the fact that the perpetrator was clearly someone from within the Sheikah community itself, possessing knowledge and abilities that made conventional security measures inadequate for detection and prevention. The very skills that made the Shadow Folk such effective guardians against external threats also made it extremely difficult to investigate misconduct by one of their own members, particularly when that individual possessed exceptional abilities and had access to the most advanced techniques and resources available to their civilization. The breakthrough in the investigation came when other Sheikah researchers began to notice subtle but significant changes in the spiritual atmosphere surrounding certain areas of the Shadow Temple, disturbances in the carefully maintained balance of forces that suggested someone was conducting unauthorized experiments with dangerous materials and forbidden techniques. These spiritual irregularities could be detected by individuals with sufficient sensitivity and training, but they were too subtle and intermittent to provide clear evidence of specific wrongdoing or to identify the individual responsible for creating them. The pattern of disturbances eventually led investigators to a previously unknown chamber deep within the temple complex, a space that had been created through unauthorized modifications to the original architecture and concealed through techniques that demonstrated masterful understanding of both physical engineering and spiritual manipulation. This hidden laboratory contained evidence of research programs that exceeded even the worst fears of those who had been tracking the mysterious thefts and disturbances. Bongo Bongo had used his stolen resources to create a comprehensive research facility dedicated to exploring the most dangerous and forbidden aspects of Sheikah knowledge, pursuing investigations that deliberately violated every ethical principle and safety restriction that had been established by centuries of accumulated wisdom and bitter experience. The laboratory contained partially completed devices of unknown but obviously malevolent purpose, experimental subjects that had been subjected to spiritual manipulations of unprecedented cruelty, and research notes that revealed the true scope of his ambitions and the methods he was prepared to employ to achieve them. The discovery of this hidden facility and the evidence it contained of systematic violation of every principle that the Sheikah community held sacred created a crisis that went far beyond simple criminal misconduct or individual corruption. Bongo Bongo's actions had demonstrated that their traditional methods of education, oversight, and community self-governance were inadequate to prevent the emergence of threats from within their own ranks, particularly when those threats involved individuals of exceptional ability who were motivated by fundamental disagreements with established doctrine and practice. More disturbing still was the realization that Bongo Bongo's research had achieved results that posed genuine threats not only to the Sheikah community, but to the broader cosmic order that they were sworn to protect. Some of his experimental work had succeeded in accessing forms of power and knowledge that were clearly beyond what any mortal consciousness should attempt to comprehend or control, creating the possibility that his corruption could spread beyond his individual person to affect the fundamental spiritual structures that maintain stability and balance throughout reality. The decision of how to respond to this unprecedented crisis divided the Sheikah leadership along lines that reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature of justice, mercy, and the appropriate methods for dealing with corruption that emerged from within their own community. Some argued for attempting to rehabilitate Bongo Bongo through spiritual healing and careful re-education, believing that his exceptional abilities could still be restored to proper service if the sources of his corruption could be identified and addressed. Others maintained that the severity of his violations and the dangerous nature of his research made such an approach impossibly risky, arguing that any attempt to preserve his life and abilities would create unacceptable possibilities for future corruption and abuse. They contended that the only responsible course of action was to ensure that his knowledge and capabilities could never again be used to threaten the cosmic order, regardless of the personal cost such a decision might require. The individual who ultimately bore the burden of making this terrible decision was Impa, the Sheikah leader, whose wisdom and spiritual strength had made her the natural choice to serve as judge and executioner in matters that exceeded the authority and understanding of conventional justice systems. The task that fell to her was not merely the elimination of a dangerous criminal, but the preservation of her community's spiritual integrity in the face of corruption that threatened to undermine the very foundations of their sacred calling. The process by which Impa carried out this grim responsibility reflected both the gravity of the situation and the sophisticated understanding of spiritual mechanics that characterized the most advanced forms of Sheikah practice. Rather than simply ending Bongo Bongo's physical existence, which would have been inadequate to address the deeper forms of corruption that had taken root in his consciousness, she employed techniques that separated his essential spiritual components in ways that prevented his malevolent knowledge and abilities from surviving his bodily death. The method that Impa used to accomplish this spiritual dismemberment was both precise and terrible, requiring her to maintain perfect focus and emotional control while performing operations that challenged every natural instinct toward mercy and compassion that defined her character. She separated Bongo Bongo's head and hands from his body, creating a state of existence where his consciousness remained partially intact, but was prevented from accessing the spiritual and physical capabilities that had made him so dangerous. The severed components of his being were then sealed within specially prepared chambers in the deepest vaults of the Shadow Temple, where they could be contained and monitored without being allowed to reconstitute into a form capable of resuming his dangerous research. This imprisonment was designed to be permanent and absolute, preventing any possibility of escape or rescue, while also ensuring that the knowledge he had gained through his forbidden experiments could not be transmitted to other potential corruptors. The execution of Bongo Bongo and the disposal of his remains marked a turning point in Sheikah history that went far beyond the resolution of a single case of individual misconduct. The techniques that had been employed in his punishment, and the knowledge that such measures might be necessary again in the future, fundamentally altered the community's understanding of its own nature and the methods that might be required to maintain its integrity against internal threats. More significantly, the discovery of Bongo Bongo's research and the evidence it provided of just how far individual corruption could progress within their community created a climate of suspicion and surveillance that was antithetical to the traditional Sheikah values of trust and autonomous responsibility. The measures that were implemented to prevent future incidents of similar corruption necessarily involved restrictions on individual freedom and privacy that changed the fundamental character of their civilization in ways that many found deeply troubling. The broader implications of the Bongo Bongo crisis extended beyond the Sheikah community itself to affect their relationships with other groups and institutions throughout the Kingdom of Hyrule. The revelation that the Shadow Folk's own internal governance had proven inadequate to prevent such severe corruption from developing and nearly succeeding in its dangerous objectives raised questions about their reliability and trustworthiness that would have far-reaching consequences for their future role as guardians and protectors. Yet the most immediate and devastating impact of the crisis was the realization that the very knowledge and capabilities that had made the Sheikah such effective guardians against external threats could also make them incredibly dangerous enemies if they were ever corrupted or turned against the right interests they had sworn to protect. The Bongo Bongo incident had demonstrated that the line between protector and threat was far thinner than anyone had previously understood, and that the same individuals who were most valuable as allies could become the most dangerous as adversaries. The psychological and spiritual trauma that resulted from these realizations affected every member of the Sheikah community, from the most senior masters to the youngest apprentices who were just beginning their education in the shadow arts. The certainties and traditions that had provided stability and meaning throughout their long history as a people were suddenly revealed to be insufficient protection against the corruption that could emerge from within their own ranks, leaving them to question fundamental assumptions about their nature and destiny. As the immediate crisis passed, and the community began the difficult process of recovery and adaptation, it became clear that the Bongo Bongo incident was not an isolated aberration, but a symptom of deeper problems that threatened the entire foundation of Sheikah civilization. The intellectual pride and spiritual arrogance that had led to his corruption were tendencies that existed to some degree in many members of their community, and the challenge of identifying and addressing these dangerous impulses before they could develop into active threats would require fundamental changes in their traditional approaches to education and governance. The tragedy that had befallen one of their most gifted and promising members served as a stark reminder that exceptional ability and profound knowledge, when divorced from proper spiritual discipline and ethical commitment, could become sources of corruption rather than instruments of service. The Shadow Folk would need to develop new methods of training and oversight that could nurture individual excellence while preventing the pride and ambition that had destroyed Bongo Bongo from taking root in future generations. The path forward from this crisis would require them to balance the competing demands of individual development and collective security, maintaining the traditions and capabilities that made them effective guardians, while adapting to new realities that made their traditional methods of community self-governance inadequate for addressing the challenges they now faced. The price of this adaptation would be measured not only in changed practices and procedures, but in the loss of innocence and trust that had previously characterized their relationships with one another and with the broader world they served. The execution of Bongo Bongo and the resolution of the immediate crisis that his corruption had created marked the beginning of a period that would prove even more challenging for the Sheikah community than the emergency itself had been, for now they were forced to confront the deeper implications of what had occurred and to rebuild their civilization on foundations that could prevent similar tragedies from emerging in the future. The task before them was not merely the restoration of damaged trust and disrupted practices, but the fundamental reimagining of their entire approach to education, governance, and the preservation of their sacred knowledge in ways that could nurture excellence while preventing the pride and ambition that had led to such devastating corruption. Impa, having borne the terrible burden of serving as judge and executioner in the Bongo Bongo crisis, now found herself uniquely positioned to guide her people through the difficult process of recovery and renewal that would be necessary to restore their community's spiritual health and practical effectiveness. Her direct experience with the most severe consequences of internal corruption gave her insights into the nature of the threats they faced that no amount of theoretical study could have provided, while her demonstrated commitment to the principles of justice and cosmic balance earned her the respect and trust necessary to implement the difficult changes that would be required. The first and most urgent task was the complete investigation and remediation of all the damage that Bongo Bongo's unauthorized research had caused to the spiritual infrastructure of the Shadow Temple and the surrounding areas. His experiments with forbidden techniques and stolen artifacts had left traces of corruption throughout the temple complex, subtle but persistent disturbances in the carefully maintained balance of forces that could eventually compromise the effectiveness of legitimate Sheikah operations if they were not identified and cleansed. This process of spiritual remediation required the combined efforts of every senior practitioner in the community, working together to map out the full extent of the contamination and develop methods for neutralizing its effects without causing additional damage to the delicate systems that had been affected. The work was both technically demanding and emotionally draining, for it required the Sheikah masters to confront direct evidence of how their own knowledge and techniques could be perverted into instruments of corruption and destruction. The cleansing of the Shadow Temple became a collective ritual of purification and renewal that served not only the practical purpose of eliminating dangerous spiritual residues, but also the psychological function of allowing the community to symbolically purge itself of the shame and guilt associated with having produced such a severe threat from within its own ranks. The process took many months to complete and required innovations in both technique and understanding that pushed the boundaries of traditional Sheikah spiritual practice. Simultaneously with this work of remediation and purification, Impa began the even more challenging task of reforming the community's educational and governance structures to prevent future incidents of internal corruption while preserving the traditions and capabilities that made the Shadow Folk effective guardians of cosmic order. This required a delicate balance between necessary security measures and the maintenance of the intellectual freedom and individual autonomy that had always been essential to the development of Sheikah abilities and understanding. The traditional system of master-student relationships that had been the foundation of Sheikah education for generations was expanded to include multiple layers of oversight and cross-training that would make it more difficult for individual corruption to develop undetected. Instead of apprentices learning exclusively from single masters, they would now rotate through multiple instructors who specialized in different aspects of the shadow arts, ensuring that no individual teacher could completely control or limit a student's exposure to orthodox doctrine and practice. New procedures were established for the documentation and review of all research projects, requiring multiple approvals for access to advanced materials and techniques, while creating systems of peer evaluation that would identify dangerous trends before they could develop into serious threats. These measures necessarily involved some reduction in the efficiency and autonomy that had previously characterized Sheikah scholarly pursuits, but the community leadership accepted these costs as necessary prices for maintaining the security and integrity of their civilization. Perhaps most significantly, Impa instituted regular spiritual examinations and evaluations for all members of the community, regardless of their rank or seniority, designed to identify the early signs of corruption or dangerous pride before they could develop into active threats. These assessments were not merely bureaucratic procedures, but profound spiritual disciplines that required participants to confront their own motivations and limitations with complete honesty and humility. The implementation of these reforms was not accomplished without resistance and controversy within the Sheikah community, for many traditionalists viewed the new restrictions and oversight mechanisms as violations of the principles of trust and individual responsibility that had always characterized their culture. Some argued that the changes were overreactions to an isolated incident that did not justify such fundamental alterations to their way of life, while others contended that excessive security measures would ultimately prove counterproductive by stifling the innovation and excellence that made their community valuable to the broader kingdom. These internal debates were conducted with the serious consideration and respectful dialogue that characterized Sheikah approaches to important decisions, but they also revealed deep philosophical divisions about the nature of their calling and the appropriate methods for fulfilling their sacred responsibilities. The resolution of these disagreements required extensive consultation and consensus building that tested Impa's leadership abilities and forced the entire community to engage in profound self-examination about their values and priorities. The reforms that ultimately emerged from this process represented a compromise that addressed the most serious security concerns while preserving as much as possible of the intellectual freedom and cultural autonomy that had always defined Sheikah civilization. The new systems were more complex and demanding than the traditional approaches they replaced, but they also provided more comprehensive protection against the kinds of threats that the Bongo Bongo incident had revealed. As the internal reorganization of Sheikah society continued, the broader political situation in the Kingdom of Hyrule was evolving in ways that would soon create new challenges and opportunities for the Shadow Folk to demonstrate their renewed commitment to their sacred calling. The long period of peace and prosperity that had allowed their civilization to flourish was beginning to show signs of strain as various political factions and interest groups competed for influence and resources within the established order. The signs of brewing conflict were subtle at first, manifesting primarily as policy disagreements and jurisdictional disputes between different levels of government and different regions of the kingdom. These tensions might have remained manageable if they had been addressed through the normal processes of negotiation and compromise that had served Hyrule well throughout its history. But they were complicated by the emergence of ambitious individuals who saw opportunity in division and conflict rather than seeking solutions through cooperation and mutual understanding. The situation was further complicated by the discovery that some of the political tensions were being deliberately exacerbated by external influences, foreign powers that sought to weaken Hyrule's stability and unity in preparation for their own aggressive designs. The Sheikah intelligence networks that had been rebuilt and reformed following the Bongo Bongo crisis proved invaluable in identifying these threats and understanding their scope and methods, providing the kingdom's leadership with crucial information about the nature of the challenges they faced. Yet the very effectiveness of Sheikah intelligence gathering created new political complications, for the information they provided sometimes revealed uncomfortable truths about the loyalty and competence of individuals in positions of authority throughout the kingdom's government and military. The Shadow Folk found themselves in the delicate position of serving their protective function while avoiding involvement in the political disputes that their investigations inevitably exposed. The crisis that would ultimately test both the reformed Sheikah community and the kingdom's ability to maintain unity in the face of external pressure began as a succession dispute following the death of the aging king and the Faciv A, emergence of competing claims to the throne from different branches of the royal family. Under normal circumstances, such disputes were resolved through established legal procedures and traditional protocols that had served the kingdom well in previous transitions of power. However, the competing claimants in this case had fundamentally different visions for the kingdom's future direction, and were supported by political factions that represented irreconcilable approaches to governance and international relations. The dispute quickly escalated beyond legal and procedural questions to encompass deeper issues about the nature of royal authority and the proper relationship between central government and regional autonomy. The situation was made even more volatile by the involvement of external powers that supported different claimants for their own strategic reasons, providing financial resources and military advisors that transformed a domestic political dispute into a proxy conflict with international implications. The kingdom that had enjoyed generations of peace and stability suddenly found itself on the brink of civil war, with different regions and communities forced to choose sides in a conflict that would determine not only who occupied the throne, but what kind of nation Hyrule would become. The Sheikah community faced an unprecedented dilemma in responding to this crisis, for their traditional role as guardians of the royal family became complicated when there were multiple competing claims to legitimate authority. Their reformed governance structures and oversight mechanisms provided clear guidance for dealing with external threats and internal corruption, but they offered little direction for navigating political disputes where reasonable people could disagree about the proper course of action. Impa and the other senior leaders spent countless hours debating their proper role in the emerging conflict, trying to balance their duty to protect the kingdom's stability and security against their responsibility to avoid partisan political involvement that could compromise their effectiveness as neutral guardians of cosmic order. The decision they ultimately reached reflected both their commitment to their sacred calling and their understanding of the practical limitations that constrained their options. Rather than supporting any particular claimant to the throne, the Sheikah would focus on protecting the kingdom's civilian population from the violence and disruption that civil war would inevitably bring, while also working to identify and counter the external influences that were helping to fuel the conflict. This approach allowed them to fulfill their protective responsibilities without compromising their neutrality or becoming entangled in political disputes that were beyond their proper authority to resolve. The implementation of this strategy required the Shadow Folk to adapt their techniques and methods to the unique challenges posed by civil conflict, where the distinction between legitimate authority and dangerous threat became blurred, and where their traditional approaches to intelligence gathering and threat assessment had to be modified to account for the complex loyalties and motivations that characterized internal political disputes. The outbreak of actual violence marked the beginning of what would become known as the Hyrulean Civil War, a conflict that would rage across the kingdom for years and test every institution and tradition that had maintained order and stability throughout the realm's history. The war was fought not only between the armies of competing claimants, but also between different visions of what the kingdom should become, making it a struggle for the very soul of Hyrulean civilization. The Sheikah found themselves operating in an environment where their traditional methods of invisible service and hidden influence were complicated by the fact that all parties to the conflict possessed some knowledge of their capabilities and were actively seeking to either recruit them as allies or neutralize them as threats. Their reputation for effectiveness and their known commitment to protecting the kingdom made them valuable potential assets, while their neutrality and their refusal to take sides made them objects of suspicion and hostility from factions that demanded absolute loyalty. The village of Kakariko, which had served as the center of Sheikah civilization since its reconstruction following the ancient disasters, found itself in a particularly vulnerable position as the conflict intensified and different military forces moved through the region. The Shadow Folk had always maintained that their community was separate from and above normal political disputes, But the reality of civil war made such distinctions increasingly difficult to maintain when armed forces demanded support and resources from every settlement they encountered. The decision to defend Kakariko against military demands and requisitions from all sides required the Sheikah to take more direct action than they had intended, using their abilities not merely to gather intelligence and counter external threats, but to actively resist the armed forces of their own kingdom when those forces threatened their community's autonomy and security. This marked a significant departure from their traditional approach to their relationship with earthly authority and set precedents that would have far-reaching implications for their future role in the kingdom. The defense of Kakariko was successful, but it came at a cost that extended far beyond the immediate military casualties and physical damage inflicted during the various attempts to subjugate or control the Shadowfolk community. The open use of Sheikah abilities in combat against Hyrulean forces, even in self-defense, created a precedent that changed how both the Shadowfolk and their fellow citizens understood the nature of their relationship and the limits of their mutual obligations. As the civil war continued to rage and its effects spread throughout the kingdom, the Sheikah community found itself increasingly isolated from the broader society it had traditionally served and protected. Their neutrality in the political conflict was interpreted by partisans on all sides as evidence of disloyalty or secret opposition, while their demonstrated ability to defend themselves against conventional military forces made them objects of fear and suspicion, even among those who had previously viewed them as valuable allies and protectors. The psychological and spiritual toll of this isolation was severe, for the Shadowfolk had always derived meaning and purpose from their service to others and their role as guardians of cosmic order. To find themselves viewed as threats rather than protectors, as enemies rather than allies, challenged fundamental assumptions about their identity and calling that had sustained them through previous crises and tragedies. The situation reached its tragic climax when the final phase of the civil war brought devastation to Kakariko itself, as the competing armies that had been unable to subdue or co-opt the Sheikah community decided that their continued independence posed unacceptable risks to their respective campaigns for ultimate victory. The attack on Kakariko was not motivated by strategic necessity or military advantage, but by the desire to eliminate a source of uncertainty and potential threat in a conflict where absolute control over all resources and populations had become essential to success. The destruction that followed was swift and merciless, overwhelming even the sophisticated defenses that the Shadowfolk had prepared against such an eventuality. The village that had been rebuilt and renewed through generations of careful work and loving dedication was reduced to ruins in a matter of days, while the vast majority of its inhabitants perished in the fighting or succumbed to injuries and exposure in the chaotic aftermath of the assault. Impa survived the destruction of her community through a combination of exceptional ability, desperate determination, and circumstances that could only be described as miraculous, but she emerged from the tragedy as virtually the sole remnant of a civilization that had endured for millennia and had contributed immeasurably to the peace and security of the kingdom that had ultimately destroyed it. The weight of being the last keeper of ancient wisdom and sacred knowledge was almost unbearable, made even more painful by the knowledge that her people's destruction had been caused, not by external enemies or cosmic forces, but by the very society they had devoted their lives to protecting. The end of the civil war and the establishment of a new unified government brought peace to the kingdom, but it could not restore what had been lost or undo the trauma that had been inflicted upon the last surviving guardian of the Shadowfolk tradition. Impa faced the dual challenge of preserving the essential knowledge and capabilities that had made her people valuable guardians, while adapting to a world where those same abilities made her an object of fear and suspicion among the very people she continued to feel called to serve and protect. The task of rebuilding began not with the reconstruction of physical structures or the restoration of institutional relationships, but with the fundamental question of whether the Sheikah tradition could or should survive in a form that would be viable in the transformed political and social environment that had emerged from the civil war. The answer to that question would determine not only Impa's own future, but the fate of knowledge and wisdom that had been accumulated across generations and could potentially be lost forever if it was not somehow preserved and transmitted to future generations who might prove more worthy of its legacy. The devastation of Kakariko and the near extinction of the Sheikah people left Impa facing a burden that no individual should have been asked to bear, yet one that the cruel circumstances of history had placed squarely upon her shoulders with no possibility of sharing or delegation. She was not merely the sole survivor of a community that had endured for millennia, but the living repository of knowledge, wisdom, and sacred traditions that had taken generations to develop and could be lost forever if she failed to find some way of preserving and transmitting them to future generations who might prove more worthy of their legacy than the society that had destroyed their creators. The immediate challenge was not philosophical or spiritual, but brutally practical. For Impa had to establish some form of stable existence in a world that had been fundamentally transformed by the Civil War and its aftermath. The new government that had emerged from the conflict was ostensibly unified and committed to peace, but it was also deeply suspicious of any individual or group that possessed capabilities or knowledge that could potentially threaten its authority or challenge its vision of how the kingdom should be organized and governed. Impa's reputation as a master of the shadow arts and her known association with the destroyed Sheikah community made her an object of particular concern for the new authorities, who viewed her as a potential source of instability and resistance in their efforts to establish complete control over all aspects of Hyrulean society. Yet her demonstrated loyalty to the kingdom and her obvious commitment to protecting innocent civilians during the Civil War had also earned her a measure of respect and trust that created opportunities for constructive engagement with the new order. The delicate negotiations that ultimately determined Impa's role in the post-war kingdom reflected both her diplomatic skills and her understanding of the political realities that constrained her options. Rather than attempting to maintain the traditional Sheikah position of invisible influence and autonomous authority, she accepted a more visible, but also more limited role as a special advisor and consultant who could provide expertise on matters that exceeded the knowledge and capabilities of conventional government agencies. This arrangement allowed her to preserve some access to resources and official recognition that would be necessary for her long-term survival and effectiveness, while also demonstrating her willingness to cooperate with the new political order rather than attempting to operate outside its authority. The compromise was far from ideal, involving significant restrictions on her freedom of action and requiring her to submit to oversight and accountability measures that would have been unthinkable for previous generations of Sheikah leaders. Yet the alternative to acceptance was exile or elimination, outcomes that would have meant the complete disappearance of the Sheikah tradition and the loss of knowledge that might prove crucial for the kingdom's future security and prosperity. Impa understood that her personal preferences and dignity were secondary to her responsibility as the keeper of her people's legacy, and she accepted the limitations placed upon her as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of preserving what could be preserved. The process of establishing her new role within the transformed kingdom required Impa to develop entirely new approaches to the traditional Sheikah mission of protecting and serving the forces of order and stability. The methods that had served her people well for generations were no longer viable in the changed political environment, and she had to innovate and adapt in ways that honored the essential principles of her calling, while acknowledging the practical constraints that now governed her activities. The most significant challenge was finding ways to maintain her protective function without appearing to threaten or challenge the authority of the established government. The new leadership was eager to benefit from her expertise and capabilities, but was also determined to ensure that she remained firmly under their control and could not become a source of independent power or influence that might compete with their own authority. This delicate balance required Impa to become far more visible and accountable in her activities than any Sheikah had ever been before, documenting her actions and decisions in ways that allowed government oversight while simultaneously preserving the essential secrecy and flexibility that made her methods effective. The challenge was particularly acute because many of her most valuable capabilities depended upon maintaining the element of surprise and the ability to operate undetected by potential threats. The solution she developed involved creating multiple layers of activity and engagement, with some aspects of her work conducted openly and transparently to satisfy the requirements for accountability and oversight, while other more sensitive operations remained concealed through techniques and methods that even her government supervisors did not fully understand. This approach allowed her to maintain her effectiveness while also demonstrating her cooperation with the established authorities. The reconstruction of Kakariko became the most visible symbol of Impa's adaptation to the new political reality and her commitment to preserving her people's legacy despite the changed circumstances. Rather than attempting to rebuild the village as an exclusively Sheikah community, she opened it to settlement by ordinary Hylians who had been displaced by the civil war and needed new homes and opportunities for rebuilding their lives. This decision represented a fundamental departure from the traditional Sheikah approach to community organization and cultural preservation, but it also reflected Impa's understanding that isolation and exclusivity had contributed to the suspicion and fear that had ultimately led to her people's destruction. By creating a mixed community where Sheikah traditions and knowledge could be shared with and gradually adopted by non-Sheikah residents, she hoped to ensure that the essential wisdom of her people would survive, even if their ethnic and cultural identity did not. The integration of Hylian settlers into the rebuilt Kakariko required careful management and considerable diplomatic skill, for the newcomers brought with them their own traditions and expectations that did not always align with Sheikah values and practices. Many of the settlers had participated in or witnessed the civil war and carried with them traumatic memories and suspicions that made them wary of anything associated with the shadow folk and their mysterious abilities. Impa approached this challenge with the same patience and wisdom that had characterized her response to previous crises, understanding that trust and acceptance would have to be earned through demonstrated service and consistent behavior rather than demanded or imposed through authority or manipulation. She worked to make herself accessible and approachable to the new residents, while also gradually introducing them to aspects of Sheikah knowledge and practice that could benefit their daily lives and long-term prosperity. The process of cultural integration was slow and sometimes difficult, marked by misunderstandings and conflicts that reflected the deeper tensions between different approaches to community organization and social interaction. The Hylian settlers were accustomed to more hierarchical and formal structures of authority, while Sheikah traditions emphasized consensus building and individual responsibility in ways that sometimes appeared chaotic or inefficient to those who were used to different methods. Yet gradually, through patience and persistent effort, a new form of community began to emerge in the rebuilt Kakariko that combined elements of both traditions in ways that served the practical needs of all residents, while also preserving the essential wisdom and capabilities that Impa was determined to maintain. The village became a living laboratory for cultural synthesis and adaptation, demonstrating that different approaches to social organization could be harmonized, rather than requiring one to dominate or eliminate the other. The success of this integration project attracted attention from throughout the kingdom, as other communities struggled to address their own post-war challenges and sought examples of successful reconstruction and renewal. Impa found herself increasingly called upon to serve as an advisor and consultant for other settlements and regions that were dealing with similar problems of displaced populations and damaged social structures. These consulting activities expanded Impa's influence and visibility throughout the kingdom, while also providing her with opportunities to identify and cultivate individuals who possessed the qualities and potential necessary to serve as the foundation for a renewed Sheikah tradition. Rather than attempting to recreate the exclusive ethnic community that had been destroyed in the Civil War, she began to envision a more diverse and inclusive approach to preserving and transmitting the essential knowledge and capabilities that define the Shadow folk tradition. This new approach to Sheikah identity and community represented a radical departure from the traditional understanding of their people as a distinct ethnic and cultural group, with exclusive claims to certain forms of knowledge and ability. Instead, Impa began to develop a vision of the Sheikah tradition as a calling and a discipline that could potentially be shared with anyone who demonstrated the necessary wisdom, dedication, and moral character to use such knowledge responsibly. The implementation of this vision required the development of entirely new methods of education and training that could convey the essential principles and practices of the shadow arts to individuals who lacked the cultural background and inherited understanding that had traditionally provided the foundation for Sheikah development. These methods had to be more explicit and systematic than the traditional apprenticeship approaches that had relied heavily on shared cultural knowledge and intuitive understanding. The process of creating these new educational approaches also forced Impa to articulate and systematize aspects of Sheikah knowledge that had previously existed primarily in the form of oral tradition and experiential learning. This work of documentation and systematization was both intellectually demanding and emotionally painful, for it required her to examine and explain traditions and practices that she had absorbed through childhood immersion rather than conscious study. Yet the effort also revealed connections and principles that had not been apparent when the knowledge existed in fragmented and implicit forms, leading to new insights and understanding that enhanced her own capabilities while also making the tradition more accessible to potential students who lacked the traditional background. The systematic approach to Sheikah education that emerged from this process was in many ways superior to the traditional methods, even though it necessarily lacked some of the cultural depth and intuitive understanding that had characterized the original tradition. As word of Impa's educational innovations spread throughout the kingdom, she began to attract students and disciples who came to Kakariko, seeking to learn the shadow arts and to contribute to the preservation and development of the Sheikah tradition. These individuals came from diverse backgrounds and brought with them different perspectives and capabilities that enriched the growing community, while also creating new challenges for integration and coordination. The most promising of these students was a young woman who demonstrated exceptional natural ability and moral character, qualities that marked her as a potential successor to carry forward the essential aspects of Sheikah leadership into the next generation. This individual, who would later be known by the name Impa in honor of her teacher and mentor, possessed both the intellectual capacity necessary to master the complex theoretical aspects of shadow arts and the spiritual strength required to use such knowledge in service of the greater good rather than personal advancement. The relationship between the elder Impa and her chosen successor became the foundation for a new understanding of how Sheikah traditions and knowledge could be transmitted across generations without relying on ethnic inheritance or exclusive cultural membership. The success of this mentor-student relationship demonstrated that the essential qualities that defined the shadow folk calling could be identified and cultivated in individuals from diverse backgrounds, provided they possessed the necessary dedication and moral foundation. As the years passed, and the immediate trauma of the Civil War began to fade into historical memory, the rebuilt Kakariko evolved from a temporary refuge for displaced persons into a thriving community that served as a model for successful integration and cultural synthesis. The village attracted visitors and residents from throughout the kingdom, creating a cosmopolitan environment that combined the best aspects of different cultural traditions while maintaining its unique identity as the center of renewed Sheikah activity. The community's success also attracted the attention of scholars and philosophers who were interested in understanding the principles and methods that had made such remarkable integration possible. These academic visitors brought with them new perspectives and theoretical frameworks that enriched the community's intellectual life, while also providing opportunities for the systematic study and documentation of Sheikah practices and principles. The scholarly interest in Kakariko and its innovative approaches to cultural preservation and transmission led to the establishment of formal academic relationships with institutions throughout the kingdom, creating networks of intellectual exchange that enhanced the community's resources, while also increasing its influence and reputation. These academic connections provided additional opportunities for identifying and recruiting individuals with the potential to contribute to the ongoing development of the Sheikah tradition. Yet, even as the community flourished, and the immediate crisis of cultural survival was successfully addressed, Impa remained aware that the fundamental challenges that had led to her people's near extinction had not been permanently resolved. The suspicion and fear that had motivated the destruction of the original Sheikah community were rooted in deeper issues about the nature of power and authority that could resurface under different circumstances and threaten the renewed tradition she was working so hard to establish. The preparation for such potential future challenges required Impa to develop contingency plans and alternative approaches that could preserve the essential knowledge and capabilities of the shadow folk tradition, even if the visible community in Kakariko was again threatened or destroyed. These preparations involved the creation of hidden repositories and secret networks that could maintain the tradition in forms that would be less visible and therefore less vulnerable to political persecution. The development of these hidden backup systems required Impa to draw upon all of her traditional Sheikah skills in concealment and misdirection, creating layers of protection and alternative preservation methods that operated according to principles that even her closest associates and students did not fully understand. The irony of using traditional shadow folk methods to protect an increasingly open and integrated community was not lost on her, but she understood that such precautions were necessary to ensure the long-term survival of what she had worked so hard to rebuild. As Impa aged and began to prepare for the eventual transition of leadership to her chosen successor, she faced the complex challenge of ensuring that the renewed Sheikah tradition would continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character and commitment to service. The community she had built was far different from the one that had been destroyed in the Civil War, but it preserved the core values and capabilities that had made the shadow folk valuable guardians of cosmic order throughout their long history. The legacy that Impa would leave behind was not merely the preservation of ancient knowledge and traditions, but the demonstration that such wisdom could be adapted and transmitted across cultural boundaries in ways that strengthened, rather than weakened, its essential power and purpose. The rebuilt Kakariko had become more than just a community. It was a living proof that the principles of service, wisdom, and protection that had defined the Sheikah calling could survive and flourish even under the most challenging circumstances. The final years of Impa's leadership were marked by a growing sense of confidence that the shadow folk tradition would indeed survive and continue to serve its cosmic purpose, albeit in forms that would have been difficult for previous generations to recognize or understand. The community had successfully navigated the transition from an exclusive ethnic identity to a more inclusive calling that could attract and nurture individuals from diverse backgrounds who shared the essential qualities of character and commitment necessary for the guardian role. As the time approached for her own transition from active leadership to elder guidance, Impa could look back on her years of service with the satisfaction that comes from having successfully fulfilled responsibilities that had seemed impossible when they were first thrust upon her by the cruel circumstances of history. She had preserved what needed to be preserved, adapted what needed to be adapted, and created something new that honored the past while serving the needs of the present and future. The Sheikah tradition would continue, changed but not destroyed, serving its eternal purpose of guarding the cosmic order and protecting the innocent, carried forward by new generations who understood both the weight of their inheritance and the possibilities for growth and renewal that lay ahead. The Renaissance that gradually transformed the scattered remnants of Sheikah civilization into a thriving and influential community represented more than mere recovery from past tragedies. It marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter in the Shadow Folk's long history, one that would see them emerge from centuries of careful concealment to assume a role of unprecedented prominence in the governance and protection of an expanded and increasingly sophisticated kingdom. The wisdom that Impa had preserved through the darkest years following the Civil War, combined with the innovative approaches to education and cultural integration that she had developed in rebuilding Kakariko, provided the foundation for developments that would have seemed impossible during the periods of persecution and near extinction that had characterized earlier eras. The transformation began subtly, manifesting first through the gradual recognition by Hyrule's political and military leadership that the unique capabilities and knowledge possessed by the renewed Sheikah community were becoming increasingly valuable in addressing challenges that exceeded the scope of conventional governance and traditional military methods. The kingdom had grown larger and more complex during the generations following the Civil War, incorporating diverse territories and populations whose integration required diplomatic and administrative skills that drew heavily upon the Shadow Folk's traditional expertise in cross-cultural communication and conflict resolution. The expanded Hyrule encompassed not only the original Hylian heartland, but also significant populations of other races and peoples who had been gradually incorporated into the kingdom through peaceful alliance and mutual cooperation rather than conquest and subjugation. The Gorons of Death Mountain had formally joined the kingdom after recognizing the mutual benefits of cooperation in mining and metallurgy, while maintaining their traditional autonomy in internal affairs and cultural practices. The Zora of the Eastern Waters had established similar relationships, contributing their expertise in aquatic engineering and their natural longevity-based institutional memory to the kingdom's collective knowledge, while preserving their own unique traditions and governance structures. The Rito of the Northwestern Peaks had proven valuable allies in communication and reconnaissance, their natural flight capabilities making them ideal messengers and scouts for maintaining contact across the kingdom's expanded territories. Even the proud Gerudo of the Southwestern Deserts had eventually established formal diplomatic relations with Hyrule, recognizing that cooperation served their interests better than the isolation and occasional conflict that had characterized earlier periods of their history. This remarkable diversity of peoples and cultures within a single political framework created administrative and diplomatic challenges that required skills and perspectives that went far beyond anything that had been necessary during the more homogeneous earlier periods of Hyrulean history. The traditional Hylian approaches to governance, while effective within their own cultural context, proved inadequate for managing the complex relationships and competing interests that characterized the expanded kingdom. The Sheikah, with their long tradition of serving as intermediaries between different groups and their sophisticated understanding of cultural dynamics and psychological motivation, proved uniquely qualified to address these challenges. Their renewed community in Kakariko had already demonstrated the possibility of successful integration between different cultural traditions, while their preserved knowledge included diplomatic and administrative techniques that had been developed over centuries of experience with exactly the kinds of complex, multicultural situations that now confronted the kingdom's leadership. The initial requests for Sheikah assistance in addressing these governance challenges were presented as temporary consultations and advisory roles, but they quickly evolved into more permanent and comprehensive assignments, as the Shadow Folk demonstrated their effectiveness in resolving disputes and facilitating cooperation that had proven intractable through conventional methods. Individual Sheikah advisors were assigned to work with regional governors and local administrators throughout the kingdom, providing guidance on cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution, while also serving as sources of intelligence and early warning about potential problems. These advisory roles gradually expanded to include more active participation in policy development and implementation, as the kingdom's leadership recognized that the Sheikah perspective on long-term planning and systematic thinking provided valuable balance to the more immediate and politically focused approaches that characterized traditional governance. The Shadow Folk's understanding of historical cycles and their awareness of how present decisions could have far-reaching consequences made them valuable contributors to strategic planning processes that attempted to address not only immediate needs, but also the long-term stability and prosperity of the kingdom. The growing influence and visibility of Sheikah advisors throughout the kingdom's administrative structure was accompanied by parallel developments in their traditional areas of specialization, as the expanded realm created new opportunities and challenges for intelligence gathering, threat assessment, and protective operations. The larger territory and more diverse population meant that potential threats could emerge from a much wider range of sources and take forms that required more sophisticated methods of detection and response than had been necessary in earlier periods. The Sheikah intelligence networks that had been carefully rebuilt following the Civil War were expanded and enhanced to provide comprehensive coverage of the kingdom's extended borders and complex internal dynamics. These networks operated according to principles that had been refined through generations of experience, but they also incorporated new techniques and technologies that reflected the Shadow Folk's ongoing tradition of innovation and adaptation to changing circumstances. The most significant development during this period was the emergence of a new generation of Sheikah leaders who combined the traditional wisdom and capabilities of their people with fresh perspectives and innovative approaches that reflected their experience growing up in the integrated community that Impa had created in Kakariko. These younger Shadow Folk possessed all of the essential skills and knowledge that had characterized their predecessors, but they also understood the broader social and political context in ways that allowed them to operate more effectively in the expanded and increasingly complex kingdom. The transition of leadership from the aging Impa to her carefully chosen successors was accomplished with the same patience and wisdom that had characterized all of her major decisions, ensuring continuity of purpose and method while also allowing for the evolution and adaptation that would be necessary to meet future challenges. The new generation of Sheikah leaders brought with them not only technical expertise, but also a more nuanced understanding of how their people's capabilities could be employed in service of the broader good, without creating the fear and suspicion that had led to past tragedies. This new leadership approach emphasized transparency and accountability in ways that would have been foreign to earlier generations of shadow folk, but which proved essential for maintaining the trust and cooperation that their expanded role required. Rather than operating exclusively in the shadows and maintaining complete secrecy about their methods and objectives, the renewed Sheikah community developed more open and collaborative approaches that allowed other groups and institutions to understand and appreciate their contributions without compromising the effectiveness of their operations. The balance between necessary secrecy and appropriate transparency required constant attention and careful judgment, but it proved to be one of the most important innovations that distinguished the renewed shadow folk tradition from its earlier incarnations. The ability to operate openly, when openness served the greater good, while maintaining concealment, when concealment was necessary for effectiveness or security, demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that exceeded anything that had been achieved by previous generations. The technological and magical innovations that accompanied this period of renaissance and expansion built upon the foundations that had been established during earlier periods of Sheikah development, but they also incorporated new understanding and capabilities that reflected the community's enhanced resources and its access to knowledge and materials from throughout the expanded kingdom. The collaboration with Goron craftsmen led to advances in metallurgy and engineering that enhanced the durability and effectiveness of Sheikah tools and devices, while cooperation with Zora scholars contributed to improvements in the theoretical understanding of magical and spiritual phenomena. The most remarkable achievement of this collaborative approach was the development of technologies and techniques that surpassed anything that any single group could have accomplished working in isolation. The combination of Sheikah knowledge of spiritual mechanics with Goron expertise in materials, science, and Zora understanding of fluid dynamics led to innovations that appeared to approach the legendary capabilities of the ancient civilizations whose ruins could still be found scattered throughout the kingdom. These technological developments were particularly significant in the area of protective and defensive systems, where the shadow folk's traditional focus on concealment and misdirection was enhanced through the incorporation of more robust and reliable mechanical and magical components. The result was the creation of security systems and protective devices that could operate effectively against a much wider range of threats than had been possible with previous generations of Sheikah technology. The enhanced capabilities that resulted from these innovations were particularly valuable in addressing the challenges posed by the kingdom's expanded borders and increased exposure to external threats. The larger territory meant that potential enemies had more opportunities to infiltrate and establish themselves within the kingdom, while the greater diversity of the population created more opportunities for internal discord and conflict that could be exploited by hostile forces. The Sheikah response to these challenges involved the development of more comprehensive and sophisticated intelligence gathering and threat assessment capabilities that could provide early warning of developing problems while also identifying the underlying causes and motivations that drove such threats. This approach emphasized understanding and addressing root causes, rather than simply responding to symptoms, reflecting the shadow folk's traditional preference for comprehensive solutions over temporary expedients. The success of these enhanced protective and intelligence capabilities was demonstrated through a series of incidents where potential threats were identified and neutralized before they could cause significant harm to the kingdom's stability and security. These successes gradually built confidence in Sheikah methods and capabilities among the kingdom's leadership and general population, creating a positive feedback cycle that enabled even greater cooperation and resource sharing. The growing trust and cooperation between the Sheikah community and the broader kingdom created opportunities for the shadow folk to share more of their accumulated knowledge and capabilities with other groups and institutions, leading to improvements in overall security and administrative effectiveness throughout the realm. Rather than hoarding their expertise for their own exclusive use, the renewed Sheikah tradition emphasized the benefits of selective sharing and collaborative development that could enhance the capabilities of all participants. This approach to knowledge sharing represented another significant innovation that distinguished the renewed shadow folk community from its predecessors, reflecting the lessons that had been learned from the isolation and suspicion that had contributed to past tragedies. The ability to identify what knowledge could be safely shared, with whom it could be shared, and under what circumstances such sharing would benefit rather than harm the greater good required sophisticated judgment and careful consideration of multiple factors. The protocols that were developed for managing these knowledge-sharing relationships became models for diplomatic and administrative cooperation that were adopted by other groups and institutions throughout the kingdom, contributing to an overall improvement in communication and coordination that enhanced the effectiveness of governance at all levels. The Sheikah tradition of systematic thinking and long-term planning proved particularly valuable in developing these protocols, ensuring that short-term benefits were not achieved at the expense of long-term stability and security. As the expanded kingdom continued to grow in prosperity and influence, attracting attention and interest from neighboring regions and distant lands, the Sheikah found their role evolving once again to encompass responsibilities that extended beyond the kingdom's borders. Their expertise in intelligence gathering and cultural analysis made them valuable resources for understanding and responding to external developments that could affect the kingdom's interests, while their diplomatic skills proved useful in establishing and maintaining relationships with foreign powers and organizations. The international dimension of Sheikah activities required the development of new capabilities and approaches that could operate effectively in unfamiliar cultural contexts and political environments, drawing upon traditional shadow folk skills while adapting them to circumstances that previous generations had never encountered. The success of these international operations demonstrated the fundamental adaptability and resilience that had always characterized the shadow folk tradition, while also revealing new possibilities for service and contribution that extended far beyond their traditional domestic focus. The expansion of Sheikah activities into international affairs was accompanied by parallel developments in their understanding of the broader cosmic and spiritual context within which their traditional protective mission operated. The growing knowledge of different cultures and belief systems provided new perspectives on the fundamental principles that governed the eternal struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness, creation and destruction that formed the ultimate backdrop for all of their activities. These expanded perspectives led to refinements and enhancements in traditional Sheikah spiritual practices and philosophical understanding that incorporated insights from diverse sources while maintaining the essential core principles that had guided their people throughout their long history. The result was a more sophisticated and comprehensive approach to their cosmic guardianship role that could address challenges and opportunities that transcended the boundaries of any single kingdom or culture. The recognition that their ultimate calling extended beyond service to any particular political entity or social group represented perhaps the most significant development in Sheikah self-understanding since their original divine appointment in the earliest days of their history. This recognition did not diminish their commitment to serving the kingdom of Hyrule and protecting its people, but it placed that service within a broader context that acknowledged their responsibilities to the cosmic order itself and to the principles of justice and harmony that transcended all temporary political arrangements. The integration of this expanded understanding into their daily activities and long-term planning required careful balance between their immediate responsibilities and their ultimate calling, ensuring that service to the greater good did not conflict with their obligations to the specific communities and institutions that depended upon their protection and support. The wisdom that had been accumulated through generations of experience with similar challenges provided guidance for navigating these complex relationships, while the flexibility and adaptability that characterized the renewed tradition enabled them to develop new approaches when traditional methods proved inadequate. The culmination of this period of renaissance and expansion was the emergence of a shadow folk community that retained all of the essential capabilities and wisdom of their ancient tradition, while also possessing enhanced effectiveness and broader influence than had ever been achieved by their predecessors. The Sheikah had successfully transformed themselves from a small and persecuted ethnic minority into a respected and influential component of a diverse and prosperous kingdom, while simultaneously preserving their unique identity and maintaining their commitment to their cosmic guardianship role. This remarkable transformation represented the fulfillment of the vision that Impa had developed during the darkest years following the Civil War, demonstrating that wisdom and dedication could overcome even the most challenging circumstances and create opportunities for growth and service that exceeded anything that had seemed possible during the periods of crisis and persecution. The Shadow Folk had not merely survived their trials, but had emerged from them stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever before, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring with confidence in their ability to adapt and serve the greater good. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadows of time, having witnessed the complete saga of the Sheikah, from their divine origins to their renaissance as guardians of an expanded realm. These shadow folk, chosen servants of the goddess, have endured exile and betrayal, near extinction and rebirth, their loyalty tested across millennia, yet never truly broken. From Impa's eternal vigil in ages past to the innovative communities of later eras, the Sheikah story is one of adaptation transcending destruction. They have been both Hyrule's greatest protectors and, through division, among its most complex challenges. Their wisdom has shaped kingdoms. Their technology has both saved and threatened civilizations, and their devotion has proven stronger than any force that sought to eliminate them. Through civil wars and cosmic battles, through periods of suspicion and times of renaissance, the Shadow Folk have demonstrated that true service sometimes requires the courage to change while preserving what matters most. Their tearing eye symbol, that ancient emblem of sight and sorrow, continues to watch over a world that has been shaped by their sacrifices and strengthened by their wisdom. Rest now in the knowledge that even in the deepest shadows, dedication endures. The Sheikah's vigil continues beyond our telling, carried forward by those who understand that the greatest guardianship is performed not for recognition, but for the simple truth that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. Let their watchful presence guard your dreams as you drift into peaceful slumber, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, faithful guardians maintain their eternal watch over the light.